Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tonight, I'm here to tell you about a case that proves how the voices of the innocent can echo across time to deliver justice. This is the story of two best friends whose courage in their final moments would ultimately solve their own murder 7 years later. On a warm February day in 2017, in the small town of Delphi, Indiana, 14-year-old Liberty German made a split-second decision that would change criminal investigation forever. As she and her best friend Abigail Williams faced unimaginable terror on an abandoned railroad bridge, Libby had the presence of mind to pull out her phone and press record. What she captured in those final moments, 4 chilling words spoken by their killer, would become some of the most analyzed evidence in criminal history. But it would take a misfiled tip, a dedicated volunteer, and more than 5 years of investigation before those recorded words would finally bring justice. This is the remarkable story of the Delphi murders, a case that shows us how technology, community determination, and the incredible bravery of 2 young girls can reach across years to ensure that evil never truly escapes. So find your comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let me take you through this extraordinary case where justice delayed was not justice denied, and where 2 teenage voices refused to be silenced, even in death. February 13, 2017 began as a day that felt like the promise of spring in Delphi, Indiana. The temperatures had climbed into the mid-40s, unusually warm for a February day in this small town of fewer than 3,000 people. Snow that had blanketed the ground for weeks was finally melting, creating small streams that trickled toward the Wabash River. For 2 teenage best friends, it seemed like the perfect day for an adventure. Delphi sits in Carroll County, Indiana, about 60 miles northwest of Indianapolis. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where high school football games draw half the town on Friday nights, and where teenagers have to be creative to find excitement. The town is bisected by the Wabash River, and just outside the main residential area lies the Delphi Historic Trail, a converted railroad track that had become a popular spot for walking, hiking, and enjoying the outdoors. On this particular February afternoon, 14-year-old Libby German and 13-year-old Abigail Abby Williams decided to spend their President's Day holiday walking the trail. They were the kind of friends who had grown up together, sharing secrets, dreams, and that particular bond that only teenage girls understand. Libby was the more outgoing of the 2, always ready with a joke or a plan for their next adventure. Abby was quieter, thoughtful, but equally eager to explore the world beyond their small town. Neither girl could have imagined that their decision to walk the trail that day would set in motion one of the most intense criminal investigations in Indiana's history, a case that would captivate the nation and test the resolve of an entire community for more than 7 years. What happened on February 13, 2017, would ultimately reveal both the darkest aspects of human nature and the incredible power of technology, persistence, and a community's refusal to let 2 young lives be forgotten. This is the story of how justice was finally served in the Delphi murders, but it's also the story of how tragedy can unite a community and how the voices of the innocent can reach across years to bring truth to light. To understand the impact of what happened on February 13, 2017, you need to understand who Liberty German and Abigail Williams were, not as victims in a crime story, but as vibrant young people with their whole lives ahead of them. Liberty German, known to everyone as Libby, was 14 years old and a freshman at Delphi Community High School. She was the kind of teenager who seemed to approach life with an infectious enthusiasm. Her friends described her as someone who could make anyone laugh, who was always planning the next group outing or adventure. She had her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's smile, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed the world was full of possibilities. Libby was passionate about photography and social media, like many teenagers of her generation. She loved documenting moments, the perfect sunset, a funny expression on a friend's face, the beauty she found in everyday moments around Delphi. Her Instagram and Snapchat accounts were filled with the typical content of a 14-year-old, selfies with friends, pictures of her dog, screenshots of funny memes, and photos that captured the simple joy of being young in a small town. Her best friend, Abigail Williams, was 13 years old and in 8th grade. Abby was the quieter of the two, but no less adventurous. She had a thoughtful nature that balanced Libby's more outgoing personality perfectly. Where Libby was quick to speak, Abby was quick to listen. Where Libby was ready to jump into new experiences, Abby was the one who made sure they thought things through, though she was always game for whatever adventure Libby proposed. Abby loved art and was known for her creativity. She could spend hours drawing, often creating detailed sketches of the world around her. Her family described her as having an old soul, someone who seemed to understand people and situations with wisdom beyond her years. She and Libby had been friends since elementary school, and their families had watched their friendship deepen and strengthen over the years. The two girls lived in a community where everyone looked out for each other. Delphi is the county seat of Carroll County, a place where agriculture and small businesses form the backbone of the economy. Main Street runs through the heart of downtown, lined with locally owned shops, a courthouse that dates back to the 1910s, and the kinds of restaurants where the waitresses know your usual order and your family's history going back 3 generations. For teenagers in Delphi, entertainment often meant being creative. There wasn't a movie theater in town, no shopping mall, no arcade. But there was the natural beauty of rural Indiana, forests, streams, trails, and wide open spaces that offered their own kind of adventure. The Delphi Historic Trail had become a popular destination for families, joggers, dog walkers, and anyone who wanted to enjoy the outdoors. The trail itself is built on an old railroad bed, creating a relatively flat, easy walk through wooded areas along the Deer Creek Valley. One of the most distinctive features of the trail is the Monon High Bridge, an abandoned railroad trestle that spans about 850 feet across the creek and valley below. The bridge stands about 70 feet high at its center, and while it's not officially part of the maintained trail system, it had become a popular spot for adventurous hikers and photographers. Walking across the old railroad bridge required careful steps, the wooden railroad ties were spaced irregularly, and gaps between them revealed the creek far below. It wasn't particularly dangerous for careful walkers, but it required attention and sure footing. For teenagers, the bridge represented a kind of rite of passage, a chance to prove their courage and capture dramatic photos with the valley spreading out below. February 13, 2017 was a school holiday, President's Day, and Libby and Abby had planned to take advantage of the unusually warm weather to explore the trail. Libby's older sister Kelsey had agreed to drop them off at the trail around 1:30 in the afternoon, with plans to pick them up later in the day. The morning of February 13, 2017 felt full of promise for the German and Williams families. The weather forecast called for temperatures in the mid-40s with partly cloudy skies, practically balmy for February in Indiana. After a winter that had seemed particularly long and cold, the prospect of spending time outdoors felt like a gift. Libby woke up that morning already excited about the day ahead. She had been texting back and forth with Abby, making plans for their trail walk. They decided they wanted to explore more of the trail system than they had on previous visits, maybe even venture out onto the old Monon High Bridge if they felt brave enough. Kelsey German, Libby's older sister, had agreed to provide transportation. At 17, Kelsey was a senior in high school, already looking ahead to graduation and college. She had a close relationship with Libby, and she was always willing to help out when her younger sister needed a ride. The plan was simple: drop the girls off at the trail entrance around 1:30 p.m., let them explore for a few hours, and pick them up before dinner. The drive to the trailhead took only about 10 minutes from the German family home. Kelsey, Libby, and Abby chatted about typical teenage topics during the short drive: school, friends, plans for the upcoming weekend. It was comfortable, familiar conversation between sisters and best friends who had shared countless car rides over the years. When they arrived at the trail parking area around 1:35 p.m., Kelsey watched as Libby and Abby gathered their things. Libby had her phone, as always, she rarely went anywhere without it. She had also brought along a small backpack with water and snacks. Abby carried her own phone and a small purse. They were dressed for the weather: jeans, boots suitable for walking on potentially muddy trails, and layers they could adjust as the temperature changed throughout the afternoon. The girls said goodbye to Kelsey and headed toward the trail entrance. Kelsey watched them for a moment, two figures walking side by side, talking and laughing as they disappeared into the tree line. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind of scene that plays out in small towns across America every day. Sisters dropping off sisters, friends embarking on a small adventure, families trusting in the safety of their community. For the first hour or so, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Libby and Abby walked the main trail, enjoying the unusually warm weather and the chance to be outdoors after a long winter. They took photos along the way, pictures of the creek, of interesting trees, of each other posing against the scenic backdrop of the Indiana countryside. Around 2:30 p.m., they decided to venture toward the Monon High Bridge. This part of the trail was less maintained, requiring them to walk through more wooded areas and navigate some uneven terrain. But they had talked about exploring the bridge for weeks, and the weather seemed perfect for the adventure. The approach to the bridge took them through increasingly isolated woodland. The main trail, while not heavily traveled on a weekday afternoon, still saw occasional walkers, joggers, and dog owners. But as they moved toward the bridge, they encountered fewer and fewer people. The woods around them were quiet except for the sounds of melting snow dripping from tree branches and the distant murmur of Deer Creek flowing below. When they reached the bridge, they were both impressed and slightly intimidated by its size and height. The structure stretched across the valley, supported by massive stone pillars that seemed to root it permanently in the landscape. The wooden railroad ties that formed the walking surface were weathered gray, with gaps between them that revealed the creek and valley floor far below. Libby, being the more adventurous of the two, decided to walk out onto the bridge first. She carefully stepped from tie to tie, testing each one before putting her full weight on it. Abby followed, more cautiously but with equal determination. They made it about halfway across, where they stopped to take photos and admire the view. It was here, in this moment of triumph and natural beauty, that Libby's phone captured images that would later prove crucial to solving their murders. Around 2:30 p.m., she took several photos of Abby standing on the bridge, with the scenic valley spreading out behind her. But in the background of one of these photos, barely visible but clearly present, was the figure of a man approaching them from behind. The photos show a middle-aged man wearing dark clothing and a blue jacket, walking across the bridge toward the girls. In the image, he appears to be alone, and there's something about his posture and approach that must have made the girls uncomfortable. Libby, with the quick thinking that would later help solve the case, began recording video on her phone. The video she captured is brief but chilling. It shows the man continuing to approach them, and it includes audio of his voice. In a low, commanding tone, he can be heard saying, "Guys, down the hill." These 4 words, spoken in a voice that carried an unmistakable threat, would become some of the most analyzed audio evidence in criminal history. What happened next remains partially unclear, but investigators believe the man forced the girls off the bridge and down a steep embankment toward Deer Creek. The terrain in this area is rough, with dense woods, fallen logs, and thick underbrush. It would have been difficult to navigate under the best circumstances, and terrifying for 2 young girls being forced along by a threatening stranger. Despite their fear, the girls continued to show remarkable presence of mind. Libby managed to ensure her phone remained recording, capturing additional audio that investigators would later use to build their case. The sounds captured in these recordings, voices, movement through the woods, and other audio details, would become crucial evidence, though out of respect for the families, much of this content has never been released to the public. By 3:30 p.m. on February 13, 2017, Kelsey German was beginning to feel the first stirrings of concern. She had arranged to pick up Libby and Abby at the trail parking area, but when she arrived, there was no sign of the girls. The parking area was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to other trail users, and the late afternoon shadows were growing longer as the sun moved lower in the sky. Kelsey waited in her car for about 15 minutes, checking her phone repeatedly for messages from Libby. It wasn't like her sister to be late without calling or texting. Libby was responsible about staying in touch, especially when someone was waiting to pick her up. When another 15 minutes passed with no word, Kelsey decided to walk a short distance along the trail, calling out for the girls. The trail felt different in the late afternoon than it had when she dropped them off earlier. The temperature was starting to drop as the sun moved lower, and the woods seemed quieter, more isolated. Kelsey called Libby's name several times, but heard only the echo of her own voice and the sound of wind moving through the bare February trees. By 4 p.m., Kelsey knew something was wrong. She drove home quickly and told her family that the girls were missing. The German family immediately began making phone calls, to the Williams family, to friends who might have seen the girls, to anyone who might know where they could be. Libby's father, Derek German, was at work when he got the call. The moment he heard that Libby and Abby were missing, he dropped everything and headed for the trail. Derek was a man who had always been protective of his daughters, but he also trusted them to make good decisions. The fact that they hadn't returned as planned, especially without calling, told him immediately that something serious had happened. The Williams family reacted with equal alarm. Abby's grandparents, who were her primary caregivers, had expected her home by dinner time. When Kelsey called to explain that the girls were missing from the trail, they immediately began their own search efforts, calling friends and family members to help look for the girls. By 5:30 p.m., both families had contacted the Carroll County Sheriff's Office to report the girls missing. In a small community like Delphi, missing person reports involving teenagers are taken seriously from the beginning. Deputy sheriff's deputies immediately responded to the trail area to begin an organized search. The initial search focused on the main trail areas where the girls were most likely to have walked. Deputies, family members, and a growing number of volunteers spread out along the trail system, calling the girls' names and looking for any sign of where they might have gone. The searchers used flashlights as daylight faded, their voices echoing through the woods as they methodically covered every accessible path and clearing. Local fire departments were called in to assist with the search, bringing additional personnel and equipment. The Delphi Fire Department, along with departments from surrounding communities, provided organized search teams with experience in woodland searches. They understood the terrain, knew the potential hazards, and could coordinate efforts to ensure no area was missed. As word of the missing girls spread through Delphi, the community response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors, teachers, church members, and people who had never met the German or Williams families showed up at the trail to help with the search. It's the kind of response that defines small-town America. When crisis strikes, the community comes together without question or hesitation. The search continued through the night, with dozens of volunteers using flashlights, lanterns, and vehicle headlights to illuminate the wooded areas around the trail. The temperature dropped into the 20s as night fell, adding urgency to the search efforts. Everyone understood that if the girls were lost or injured in the woods, exposure to the cold could quickly become life-threatening. Social media played a crucial role in organizing and expanding the search efforts. Posts on Facebook and other platforms spread the word throughout the region, asking for volunteers and sharing photos of Libby and Abby. The hashtag #FindLibbyandAbby began trending locally, and the story was picked up by news outlets throughout Indiana and beyond. By midnight, the organized search had expanded to include multiple law enforcement agencies. The Indiana State Police had been called in to assist, bringing additional resources and expertise in missing person cases. The FBI also offered support, recognizing that the case might involve federal crimes if the girls had been abducted and taken across state lines. The night of February 13th to 14th was one of the longest in the lives of the German and Williams families. They maintained a vigil at the search command post that had been set up near the trail, coordinating with law enforcement and volunteers, answering questions about the girls' habits and friends, and trying to think of anywhere else they might have gone. But as dawn approached on February 14th, everyone involved in the search knew they were no longer looking for two girls who had simply gotten lost on a hiking trail. The intensive search had covered every accessible area around the trail system multiple times. If Libby and Abby were anywhere in the immediate vicinity, they would have been found. The realization that something terrible had happened to the girls settled over the search teams like a heavy blanket. But rather than diminishing their efforts, this knowledge only intensified the determination to find answers. The search would continue, but it had transformed from a rescue operation into a criminal investigation. February 14, 2017 dawned cold and gray in Delphi, Indiana. Valentine's Day, normally a day of celebration and joy, had taken on a grim significance for the hundreds of people involved in searching for Liberty German and Abigail Williams. The overnight search had yielded no trace of the girls, and as morning light filtered through the bare trees along Deer Creek, the focus shifted to areas that hadn't been accessible in the darkness. The search on February 14 was more systematic and expanded than the previous evening's efforts. Law enforcement had divided the area around the trail into grid sections, with teams assigned to search each area methodically. The Indiana State Police had taken the lead in coordinating the investigation, bringing in specialized search and rescue teams, K-9 units, and investigators experienced in missing person cases. One of the search areas that had been identified as a priority was a section of private property on the north side of Deer Creek, across the water from the main trail system. This area was heavily wooded and difficult to access, which had made it impossible to search thoroughly during the night. The property owner had given permission for searchers to access the land, and several teams were assigned to comb through the dense woods and underbrush. Around 12:15 p.m. on February 14, one of the volunteer search teams made a discovery that would end the hopes and prayers of two families and send shockwaves through the community of Delphi. In a wooded area approximately half a mile east of the Monon High Bridge, searchers found the bodies of Liberty German and Abigail Williams. The discovery was made by a group of volunteers who had been systematically searching the wooded area since early morning. When they realized what they had found, they immediately stopped their search and contacted law enforcement. Within minutes, the area was secured as a crime scene, and the volunteers were moved away to preserve any evidence that might help investigators understand what had happened to the girls. The news spread quickly through the search command post and then throughout the community. For the families who had spent more than 24 hours hoping against hope that their daughters would be found alive, the confirmation of their worst fears was devastating. But even in their grief, they were grateful to the volunteers who had never given up the search, who had brought their daughters home. The crime scene was immediately secured by law enforcement, with the area cordoned off and access restricted to essential personnel only. The Indiana State Police called in their crime scene investigation team, along with the Carroll County coroner and forensic specialists who would carefully document and analyze every aspect of the scene. What investigators found at the crime scene provided both crucial evidence and heartbreaking confirmation that the girls had been murdered. The details of their injuries and the condition of the crime scene were kept confidential out of respect for the families, but it was clear that both girls had been killed, and that their deaths were the result of homicide, not accident or natural causes. Perhaps most importantly for the investigation that would follow, investigators recovered Liberty German's cell phone near the crime scene. The phone had been damaged but was still functional, and when investigators examined its contents, they discovered that Libby had managed to capture both audio and video recordings of the person who had approached them on the bridge. The discovery of these recordings was a breakthrough that gave investigators their first real lead in the case. The video showed a middle-aged man walking on the Monon High Bridge, and the audio captured his voice saying, "Guys, down the hill." While the quality wasn't perfect, the recordings provided crucial evidence about the suspect's appearance and voice. The autopsies of Liberty German and Abigail Williams were conducted on February 15, 2017, by the Carroll County coroner. The results confirmed that both girls had been murdered, though the specific details of their injuries were not released to the public. The coroner determined that the girls had died on February 13, likely within hours of when they were last seen alive. The funerals for Liberty German and Abigail Williams were held on February 19, 2017, drawing thousands of mourners from throughout Indiana and beyond. The Delphi Community High School gymnasium was filled to capacity, with overflow crowds watching from the school auditorium and lobby. The services celebrated the lives of two young women who had touched countless people in their brief time on Earth, while also serving as a rally cry for justice. During the funeral services, speakers talked about Libby's infectious laugh and adventurous spirit, about Abby's artistic talent and thoughtful nature. They spoke about the friendship between the girls, the way they had supported and complimented each other, and the bright futures that had been stolen from them. But they also spoke about determination, the determination of their families, their community, and law enforcement to find the person responsible for their deaths. The investigation into the murders of Liberty German and Abigail Williams was just beginning, but already it had captured national attention. The case had all the elements that draw media coverage and public interest: innocent victims, a mysterious perpetrator, and a small community united in grief and determination. More importantly, investigators had evidence, the audio and video recordings from Libby's phone, that gave them hope that the case could be solved. The murder investigation that began on February 14, 2017, would become one of the most intensive and closely followed criminal cases in Indiana history. The Indiana State Police, working in partnership with the Carroll County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, assembled a task force dedicated solely to finding the person responsible for killing Liberty German and Abigail Williams. The first major break in the case came from an unexpected source: Liberty German's cell phone. The device had been recovered near the crime scene, and when forensic specialists examined its contents, they discovered that Libby had shown remarkable presence of mind in the final moments of her life. Not only had she captured video and audio of the suspect, but she had also created a digital trail that would prove crucial to the investigation. The video footage, though brief, showed a middle-aged white male walking on the Monon High Bridge. He was wearing dark jeans, a dark jacket, and what appeared to be a hoodie underneath. His hands were in his pockets, and he walked with a distinctive gait that investigators hoped someone would recognize. The audio recording captured his voice clearly: "Guys, down the hill," words spoken in a tone that conveyed unmistakable authority and threat. On February 15, 2017, just 3 days after the girl's disappearance, Indiana State Police released the first composite sketch of the suspect. The sketch, based on eyewitness descriptions and the video footage, showed a white male between 40 and 50 years old, with reddish-brown hair and a mustache or goatee. The sketch was distributed throughout Indiana and neighboring states, generating hundreds of tips from people who thought they recognized the man. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate crime scene. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people who had been in the area of the Delphi Historic Trail on February 13, 2017. They spoke with other hikers, joggers, dog walkers, and anyone else who might have seen something unusual. They collected security camera footage from businesses along the routes leading to and from the trail, looking for vehicles that might have been driven by the suspect. One of the most significant developments came from witness interviews. Several people reported seeing a man matching the suspect's description in the area of the trail on February 13. Some had seen him walking alone, others had noticed him near the bridge area around the time the girls would have been there. These witness accounts helped establish a timeline and confirmed that the man in Libby's video was indeed the person responsible for the murders. The FBI became heavily involved in the case, bringing resources and expertise that local law enforcement couldn't match. They established a dedicated tip line and created a website specifically for the Delphi murder investigation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of the likely suspect, describing him as someone familiar with the area who had probably spent time around the trail system before the murders. As weeks turned into months, the investigation generated thousands of tips from across the country. Each tip had to be followed up, investigated, and either ruled out or pursued further. The task force developed a complex system for tracking and prioritizing leads, with investigators working around the clock to process the incoming information. The case gained additional momentum when investigators decided to release the audio recording of the suspect's voice. On February 22, 2017, the phrase, "Guys, "Down the Hill," was played at a press conference and distributed to media outlets nationwide. The hope was that someone would recognize the voice and provide the tip that would break the case open. The audio release generated an enormous response. The tip line was flooded with calls from people who thought they recognized the voice. Family members, co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances all called in with suggestions about possible suspects. Each call had to be investigated, but the sheer volume of responses made it clear that the case had captured the public's attention in an unprecedented way. As the first anniversary of the murders approached, investigators faced a difficult reality. Despite thousands of tips, hundreds of interviews, and extensive forensic analysis, they still hadn't identified the killer. The case remained at the top of the Indiana State Police's priority list, but the initial momentum was beginning to slow. In April 2018, investigators made the decision to release additional information about the case. They revealed that they had recovered DNA evidence from the crime scene, though they didn't specify what type of DNA or how much had been recovered. They also announced that they were working with genealogy experts to try to identify the suspect through genetic genealogy techniques. The DNA revelation brought new hope to the investigation. Genetic genealogy had recently been used to solve several high-profile cold cases, including the Golden State Killer case in California. The technique involves comparing crime scene DNA to genetic profiles in genealogy databases, potentially identifying distant relatives of the suspect who could lead investigators to their target. However, the genetic genealogy approach proved more challenging than investigators had hoped. The DNA evidence from the Delphi crime scene was limited in quantity and quality, making it difficult to generate the kind of comprehensive genetic profile needed for genealogy searches. The investigation continued, but this promising avenue didn't yield immediate results. By 2019, the case had evolved into a true cold case investigation. The task force was scaled back, though several dedicated investigators continued working on the case full-time. The families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams maintained their advocacy efforts, organizing annual memorial walks and keeping media attention focused on the unsolved murders. The persistence of the families and the continued dedication of investigators would eventually pay off, but not in the way anyone expected. The break in the case would come not from advanced DNA technology or genetic genealogy, but from old-fashioned police work and a lucky discovery in a filing cabinet. For more than 5 years, the murders of Liberty German and Abigail Williams remained one of Indiana's most frustrating unsolved cases. Despite thousands of tips, extensive forensic analysis, and the dedicated efforts of a multi-agency task force, the killer remained unidentified. The case had generated national attention, spawned countless theories on social media and true crime forums, and become a symbol of the challenges facing modern law enforcement. But sometimes the most significant breakthroughs come from the most unexpected places. In September 2022, more than 5.5 years after the murders, a retired state government worker named Kathy Schenk was volunteering her time to help organize case files for the Delphi investigation. Schenk had been working with law enforcement agencies throughout her career and had offered to assist with the massive amount of paperwork that had accumulated over the years. While sorting through boxes of tips and reports, Schenk came across a piece of paperwork that had somehow been misfiled and overlooked for years. It was a tip sheet from February 2017, just days after the girls' bodies were found. The tip documented a call from a man who said he had been on the Delphi Historic Trail on February 13, 2017, and wanted to let police know in case it was helpful to their investigation. The caller had identified himself as Richard Allen, and he lived in Delphi. According to the tip sheet, Allen had told investigators that he had been on the trail that afternoon, had walked out onto the Monon High Bridge, and had seen 3 girls near the Freedom Bridge area of the trail. He said he had been wearing blue jeans and a blue or black jacket, and that he had left the trail around 1:30 p.m. What made this tip significant was the timing and location. Allen had placed himself on the trail at exactly the time and place where the murders had occurred. He had also described clothing that was consistent with what the suspect was wearing in Liberty German's video. Most importantly, he had voluntarily contacted police, but somehow his tip had been misfiled and never properly investigated. Detective Tony Liggett, who was leading the Delphi investigation in 2022, immediately recognized the significance of Schenk's discovery. Allen's tip placed him at the scene of the crime at the exact time of the murders, wearing clothes that matched the suspect's description. It was the kind of lead that investigators had been hoping for since the beginning of the case. On October 13, 2022, Detective Liggett and other investigators went to Richard Allen's home in Delphi to interview him. Allen, who was 50 years old and worked at a local CVS pharmacy, agreed to speak with the investigators. During the interview, Allen confirmed that he had been on the trail on February 13, 2017, and that he had walked out onto the Monon High Bridge. But as the interview progressed, Allen's story began to change in subtle but significant ways. He modified his timeline, adjusted his description of what he had been wearing, and seemed to become increasingly nervous as the questions continued. Most significantly, when investigators showed him the video from Liberty German's phone, Allen could not definitively rule out that he was the person in the footage. Based on the interview and Allen's placement at the crime scene, investigators obtained a search warrant for his home and property. The search, conducted on October 13, 2022, yielded additional evidence that linked Allen to the murders. While the specific details of what was found were not immediately released, investigators had enough evidence to arrest Richard Allen on charges of murder. Richard Allen was taken into custody on October 26, 2022, more than 5 years after the murders of Liberty German and Abigail Williams. The arrest sent shockwaves through Delphi, where Allen had lived and worked for years without anyone suspecting his involvement in the case. He had been hiding in plain sight, a seemingly ordinary member of the community who had somehow evaded detection despite being one of the first people to contact police about the case. Allen was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of murder while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. If convicted, he faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. The charges were filed under seal initially, but news of the arrest quickly leaked to media outlets and spread throughout the community. The arrest of Richard Allen marked a turning point in the case, but it also raised new questions. How had he managed to avoid detection for so long? What evidence had ultimately linked him to the murders? And most importantly for the families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams, would this arrest finally lead to justice for their daughters? Allen was held in the Carroll County Jail initially, but due to safety concerns and the high-profile nature of the case, he was later transferred to a state correctional facility. He was placed in protective custody, isolated from other inmates who might target him because of the nature of his alleged crimes. The arrest brought a mixture of relief and apprehension to the families of the victims. They were grateful that someone had finally been charged with their daughter's murders, but they also knew that the legal process was just beginning. It would be months, possibly years, before the case went to trial and they could know for certain whether justice would be served. The legal proceedings against Richard Allen began in earnest in late 2022, but the path to trial would prove to be complex and lengthy. The case had generated enormous public interest, and Allen's defense team immediately began challenging various aspects of the prosecution's case. They filed motions to suppress evidence, requested changes of venue, and argued that their client could not receive a fair trial given the extensive media coverage of the case. One of the most significant developments in the case came from Allen's behavior while in custody. According to prosecutors, Allen confessed to the crime more than 60 times while incarcerated, including confessions to his wife, his mother, the psychologist who treated him, the warden and other prison employees and inmates. These confessions would become a central element of the prosecution's case. The confessions were particularly significant because they included details about the crime that had not been released to the public. Allen allegedly described specific aspects of how the murders were committed, details that only the killer would know. These confessions provided prosecutors with powerful evidence, though Allen's defense team argued that his mental state in prison made the confessions unreliable. The defense strategy centered on challenging the reliability of Allen's confessions and the strength of the physical evidence. They argued that Allen's mental health had deteriorated significantly while in solitary confinement, making his statements involuntary and unreliable. They also questioned the chain of custody for evidence and argued that the investigation had been flawed from the beginning. As the case moved toward trial, additional evidence emerged that strengthened the prosecution's case. Forensic analysis had linked a bullet found at the crime scene to a gun owned by Allen, though he claimed he had never fired the weapon at the scene. Cell phone data also placed Allen in the area during the time of the murders, contradicting some of his earlier statements to police. The trial began in October 2024, more than 7 years after the murders. The courtroom was packed with family members, media representatives, and community members who had followed the case since the beginning. The prosecution, led by Carroll County Prosecutor Nicholas McClelland, presented a methodical case that relied heavily on Allen's confessions, the physical evidence, and witness testimony placing him at the scene. The defense, led by attorneys Bradley Rozzi and Andrew Baldwin, focused on creating reasonable doubt about Allen's guilt. They argued that the investigation had been compromised by the initial misfiling of Allen's tip, that the confessions were the product of a deteriorating mental state, and that the physical evidence was circumstantial rather than definitive. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was the enhanced audio and video from Liberty German's phone. Forensic experts had worked for years to improve the quality of the recordings, and when played in court, the voice saying, "Guys, down the hill," was clear and distinct. Voice comparison experts testified that the voice was consistent with Allen's speech patterns, though they could not make a definitive identification. The testimony of Libby's sister Kelsey was particularly emotional. She described dropping the girls off at the trail that day, never imagining it would be the last time she would see them alive. Her testimony helped establish the timeline of events and provided crucial context for the jury about the victim's final day. Throughout the trial, the prosecution emphasized the courage and quick thinking that Liberty German had shown in her final moments. They argued that her decision to record the suspect had ultimately led to his identification and arrest, making her a hero even in death. The video and audio evidence, they contended, was Libby's gift to the investigation that would finally bring justice. The defense presented their own expert witnesses who questioned the reliability of the voice analysis and the interpretation of the physical evidence. They suggested that the investigation had been compromised by tunnel vision, with investigators focusing on Allen to the exclusion of other possible suspects. After deliberating for several days, the jury reached their verdict. On November 11, 2024, Richard Allen was found guilty on all counts, 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of murder while committing kidnapping. The verdict was met with tears of relief from the families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams, who had waited more than 7 years for this moment. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on whether Allen would receive life in prison without parole or the death penalty. The prosecution argued for the harshest possible sentence, emphasizing the heinous nature of the crimes and the impact on the families and community. The defense asked for mercy, pointing to Allen's lack of prior criminal history and his mental health issues. On December 20, 2024, Richard Allen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that while the death penalty was a possibility, the life sentence ensured that Allen would never again have the opportunity to harm anyone while providing the finality that the families deserved. The conviction of Richard Allen marked the end of one of the longest and most closely watched criminal investigations in Indiana history. For the families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams, it represented the justice they had fought for since that terrible day in February 2017. But more than that, it validated the incredible courage their daughters had shown in their final moments. The case became a testament to the power of technology in modern criminal investigations. Liberty German's decision to record her attacker with her cell phone had ultimately led to his conviction, demonstrating how a 14-year-old girl's quick thinking could reach across years to deliver justice. The audio and video evidence she captured became her voice speaking from beyond, ensuring that her killer would not escape accountability. The investigation also highlighted the importance of community involvement in solving crimes. The thousands of tips that poured in from across the country, the volunteers who searched for the girls, and the retired government worker who discovered the misfiled tip all played crucial roles in bringing the case to resolution. It showed that justice often depends not just on law enforcement, but on ordinary citizens who refused to let crimes go unsolved. For the town of Delphi, the conviction brought a sense of closure to a tragedy that had defined the community for more than 7 years. The case had put this small Indiana town on the national map for all the wrong reasons, but it had also demonstrated the resilience and unity of its people. The community had never given up hope that justice would be served, and their persistence had been vindicated. The families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams used the resolution of the case to advocate for other families dealing with unsolved crimes. They established foundations in their daughters' names to support other victims' families and to promote safety education for young people. Their tragedy had been transformed into a force for good, helping others navigate similar losses. The Delphi murders case also influenced law enforcement practices across the country. The initial misfiling of Richard Allen's tip led to reforms in how tips are processed and tracked in major investigations. The case demonstrated the importance of meticulous record-keeping and the need for systematic review of all evidence, no matter how routine it might seem. As we reflect on this case, we remember Liberty German and Abigail Williams not as victims, but as brave young women who faced unimaginable terror with courage and presence of mind. Libby's decision to record her attacker turned her into a detective in her own murder case, providing the evidence that would ultimately convict her killer. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can shine through. The Delphi Historic Trail continues to be a place where people come to remember Libby and Abby. A memorial has been established near the trail, where visitors can leave flowers and pay their respects. The bridge where they were last seen alive has become a place of pilgrimage for those touched by their story. 7 years after that February day when two best friends set out for a simple walk in the woods, justice has finally been served. The case of the Delphi murders reminds us that while evil exists in the world, the forces of good, family love, community support, persistent investigation, and the courage of two young girls, can ultimately prevail. Richard Allen will spend the rest of his life in prison, but Liberty German and Abigail Williams will be remembered for their bravery, their friendship, and their refusal to be silenced even in death. Their voices, captured in those final moments, spoke across the years to deliver justice and ensure that they would never be forgotten. As we conclude this story, we remember that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives were forever changed by tragedy. The families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams have shown incredible strength and grace throughout this ordeal, and their daughter's memory continues to inspire others to seek justice and never give up hope. In the quiet town of Delphi, Indiana, where this story began, the seasons continue to change, the trail remains open to visitors, and two young women are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived, and for the courage they showed that ultimately brought their killer to justice. The case is closed, but the legacy of Liberty German and Abigail Williams lives on, reminding us all that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to make a difference, to seek justice, and to ensure that those we love are never forgotten. Honestly, I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you for your continued support. I'm grateful for each and every one of you. If you're enjoying the content, please consider sharing it with others who might appreciate it too. And to those who haven't subscribed yet, I'd love for you to join our community, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. And please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Frederick, Colorado sits about 30 miles north of Denver, nestled against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. It's the kind of place where new subdivisions stretch toward the horizon, where young families come to build their version of the American dream. The streets are lined with two-story homes, each with carefully manicured lawns and two-car garages. It's suburban America at its most aspirational, safe, clean, and full of promise. In the summer of 2018, one house on Saratoga Trail seemed to embody everything that Frederick represented. It was a modest but well-kept home where Christopher Watts lived with his pregnant wife Shannon and their two young daughters, Bella, who was 4, and Celeste, who had just turned 3. From the outside, they appeared to be living the perfect life. Shannon Watts was 34 years old, a vivacious woman with an infectious smile and an entrepreneurial spirit. She worked for a multi-level marketing company called Lavelle, selling health and wellness products through social media. Her Facebook and Instagram accounts painted a picture of domestic bliss, family vacations, birthday parties, romantic dinners with her husband, and the everyday joy of raising two beautiful little girls. The posts showed a family that seemed to have it all. Chris, 33, worked in the oil fields, a steady job that provided for his family. Shannon frequently posted about how grateful she was for her husband, calling him her rock and her best friend. The couple had been married since 2012, and despite some financial struggles that many young families face, they seemed committed to building a life together. Their daughters, Bella and Celeste, were the center of their world. Bella was bright and inquisitive, already showing signs of the same entrepreneurial spirit as her mother. She loved to help Shannon with her business presentations, often appearing in videos as a charming sidekick. Celeste, whom they called Cece, was the family comedian, always ready with a smile or a silly dance that would make everyone laugh. In August 2018, Shannon was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a son they planned to name Nico. The pregnancy had been challenging. Shannon suffered from lupus, an autoimmune condition that complicated her pregnancies, but she was overjoyed about expanding their family. She had announced the pregnancy to Chris in a touching video that she later shared on social media, capturing his surprised and seemingly happy reaction. But behind the carefully curated social media posts and the facade of suburban perfection, the Watts marriage was crumbling. Chris had been having an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger, a relationship that had begun in June 2018. As Shannon focused on her pregnancy and her business, posting about their happy family life, Chris was living a double life, planning a future that didn't include his wife and children. The contrast between public perception and private reality would become one of the most chilling aspects of what was about to unfold. While Shannon posted photos of family dinners and date nights, Chris was researching apartments for himself and Nicole. While she talked about their upcoming son and their growing family, Chris was telling his mistress that he was separated and in the process of getting divorced. Monday, August 13, 2018, began like any other summer day in Frederick, Colorado. The sun rose over the mountains, children played in backyard sprinklers, and neighbors went about their daily routines. No one could have imagined that by the end of that day, 3 lives would be lost and a community would be forever changed. The story of what happened to Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts is more than just a true crime case. It's a story about how the people we think we know best can sometimes be strangers, how social media can create illusions that mask darker truths, and how a community's sense of safety can be shattered in an instant. But it's also a story about the dedication of investigators, the power of technology in modern criminal justice, and ultimately, the pursuit of truth and justice for 3 innocent victims. To understand what happened on August 13, 2018, you need to understand who Shannon Watts was, not just as a victim in a crime story, but as a vibrant woman who lived her life with passion and determination. Shannon Razusek was born in New Jersey in 1984, the daughter of Sandra and Frank Razusek. She grew up in a close-knit family with her younger brother Frankie, who would remain one of her closest confidants throughout her life. From an early age, Shannon showed the kind of personality that drew people to her. She was outgoing, optimistic, and had a natural ability to make others feel special and included. After high school, Shannon moved to North Carolina, where she worked in various jobs before eventually finding her calling in sales and marketing. She had a gift for connecting with people, for understanding what they needed and helping them find solutions. It was a skill that would serve her well in her later career with Lavelle, where she quickly became one of their top promoters. Shannon's move to Colorado came after she met Christopher Watts. Chris was different from the outgoing, social men she had typically dated. He was quiet, reserved, almost shy in social situations. But there was something about his calm demeanor that appealed to her. He seemed stable, reliable, the kind of man who would be a good husband and father. They met online and began a long-distance relationship that eventually led to Chris moving to North Carolina to be with Shanann. The early years of their relationship seemed happy. Chris appeared to embrace Shanann's social nature, even if he preferred to stay in the background. Friends and family described him as devoted to Shanann, willing to go along with her plans and ambitions. When they married in 2012, it seemed like a perfect match, Shanann's vibrant personality complemented by Chris's steady presence. They moved to Colorado together, where Chris had found steady work in the oil industry and Shanann continued building her career in direct sales. The birth of Bella in 2013 brought immense joy to both of them. Shanann documented every milestone, every adorable moment, sharing her happiness with friends and family through social media. Chris seemed to embrace fatherhood, and photos from that time show him holding Bella with what appears to be genuine affection and pride. Celeste's arrival in 2015 completed what seemed to be their perfect family. The girls were just 22 months apart, close enough in age to be playmates and companions. Shanann often posted about how different their personalities were. Bella was the serious, thoughtful one, while Cece was the entertainer, always ready to perform for anyone who would watch. But even as their family grew, there were signs that not everything was as perfect as it appeared on social media. The couple faced financial pressures that are common to many young families. Chris's income from the oil fields was steady but not substantial, and Shanann's earnings from Lavelle, while sometimes significant, were inconsistent. They had credit card debt, a mortgage, and the ongoing expenses of raising two young children. Shanann's health also presented ongoing challenges. Her lupus diagnosis meant that she had to carefully manage her condition, especially during pregnancies. She was often tired, sometimes struggled with joint pain and other symptoms, and required regular medical care. While she rarely complained publicly, those close to her knew that she was dealing with more than she let on. Chris, for his part, seemed to grow more distant over time. Friends and co-workers would later describe him as increasingly withdrawn, less engaged in family activities, more focused on his own interests. He had developed a passion for fitness, spending hours at the gym and paying close attention to his diet and appearance. While this might have seemed like a positive change, those who knew him noticed that it coincided with him becoming less involved in family life. The summer of 2018 was particularly challenging for the Watts family. Shanann had taken the girls to North Carolina for an extended visit with her family, partly to escape the tension that had been building in their marriage. The separation gave both Chris and Shanann time to think about their relationship, but they seemed to reach different conclusions. For Shanann, the time away reinforced how much she valued her marriage and family. She was determined to work through their problems, to rebuild the connection they had once shared. She planned the pregnancy announcement as a way to bring them closer together, hoping that the prospect of a son would reignite Chris's commitment to their family. For Chris, however, the separation seems to have confirmed his desire to start over. It was during this time that his relationship with Nicole Kessinger began, and he started to envision a different kind of future for himself. While Shanann was in North Carolina planning their family's future, Chris was in Colorado planning his escape from it. The photos and videos from Shanann's final week show a woman who was trying desperately to save her marriage. She posted about missing Chris, about being excited to come home, about their upcoming date night. But beneath the surface, she was increasingly aware that something was wrong. Text messages between them during this time reveal a woman trying to understand why her husband seemed so distant, so unwilling to engage with her efforts to reconnect. Monday, August 13, 2018, began at 1:48 a.m. when Shanann's flight from Phoenix landed at Denver International Airport. She had been visiting friends in Arizona after her extended stay with family in North Carolina, and she was exhausted from the travel and the stress of her deteriorating marriage. Nicole Kessinger had dropped Chris off at the airport to pick up Shanann, though she waited in the parking lot to see if Chris would text her after the reunion. It was a strange dynamic, the mistress helping the husband pick up his wife, but it reflected the complicated web of deception that Chris had been weaving for months. The drive home from the airport was tense. Shannon later texted her friend that Chris had been cold and distant during the hour-long drive to Frederick. She said he barely spoke to her, didn't ask about her trip, and seemed annoyed that she was tired and emotional. For a woman who was 15 weeks pregnant and had been traveling for hours, his lack of empathy was particularly hurtful. They arrived home around 2 a.m. to a house that felt different to Shannon. Chris had made changes while she was gone. He had cleaned out closets, rearranged furniture, and thrown away some of her belongings. To Shannon, it felt like he was erasing her presence from their home, preparing for a life without her. The couple went to bed without resolving any of their issues. Shannon was too tired to have the difficult conversation she knew they needed to have, and Chris seemed determined to avoid any serious discussion about their relationship. They slept in the same bed but might as well have been strangers. Monday morning brought no improvement in their relationship. Chris got ready for work as usual, but his demeanor remained cold and distant. Shannon, who was dealing with morning sickness and exhaustion, tried to engage him in conversation about their problems, but he was unresponsive. Around 11 a.m., while Chris was at work, Shannon sent him a long text message. In it, she laid out her feelings about their relationship, her concerns about his behavior, and her desire to work on their marriage. She asked him directly if he wanted to be with her and the children, and she made it clear that she was willing to fight for their family. Chris's response was brief and emotionally detached. He said they would talk when he got home from work, but he gave no indication of what that conversation might entail. For Shannon, who was looking for reassurance and affection, his response was devastating. That afternoon, Shannon had a doctor's appointment to check on her pregnancy. The appointment went well, the baby was healthy and developing normally, but Shannon's joy about the pregnancy was overshadowed by her anxiety about her marriage. She texted friends about her concerns, saying that she felt like Chris was slipping away from her and she didn't know how to reach him. Chris left work around 2 p.m., claiming that he had a meeting with clients at their home. This was unusual. Chris rarely had work meetings at home, but his supervisors didn't question it. What they didn't know was that Chris had no meeting scheduled. Instead, he was coming home to confront a situation that he felt had become impossible to resolve. The afternoon hours between Chris arriving home and the evening are crucial to understanding what happened next, but they remain largely a mystery. Shannon's phone records show that she sent her last text message around 6 p.m. to a friend, saying that she and Chris were going to have a serious conversation about their marriage. Security cameras from a neighbor's house would later show Chris's truck leaving the family home around 5:27 a.m. on Tuesday, August 14th. The truck appeared to be loaded with something in the bed, covered by a tarp. This would be the last time Chris Watts was seen at his home as a free man. What happened during those dark hours between Monday evening and Tuesday morning would only be fully revealed weeks later, when Chris finally confessed to his crimes. But even on Tuesday morning, as neighbors began their daily routines and children played in yards throughout the subdivision, there were signs that something terrible had occurred at 2825 Saratoga Trail. The house that had been the center of so much social media activity, so many posts about family happiness and domestic bliss, was now silent. The children who had filled it with laughter and energy were gone. The woman who had documented every aspect of their lives was no longer there to share their story. By Tuesday afternoon, when Shannon failed to show up for a scheduled doctor's appointment and didn't respond to calls and texts from worried friends, the perfect facade that had defined the Watts family would begin to crumble. The investigation that followed would reveal not just the details of 3 tragic murders, but the devastating truth about how well we can know the people closest to us. The last day of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts's lives began with hope that a family could be saved, that love could overcome difficulties, that children could grow up safe in their own home. It ended with a crime so shocking that it would change not just one Colorado community, but the way people across the country think about domestic violence and the facades people can maintain even as they plan unspeakable acts. Tuesday, August 14, 2018, began like any other summer day in Frederick, Colorado, but by evening, it would become clear that something was terribly wrong at the Watts family home. The first sign of trouble came when Shannon failed to show up for a scheduled doctor's appointment at 10 a.m. Given her history of lupus and her high-risk pregnancy, missing medical appointments was completely out of character for her. The doctor's office called to check on her, but there was no answer at the house. Around the same time, Shannon's friend and business partner, Nicole Toft Atkinson, was becoming increasingly concerned. Shannon had been scheduled to host a Lavelle business meeting at her home that morning, but she hadn't shown up and wasn't responding to phone calls or text messages. This was extremely unusual behavior for Shannon, who was always professional and reliable about her business commitments. Nicole decided to drive to the Watts home to check on her friend. When she arrived around 12 p.m., she found Shannon's car in the driveway, but no one answered the door. She could see that the house was locked up tight, with all the blinds closed. She walked around the property, calling out for Shannon and the girls, but heard nothing. Growing increasingly worried, Nicole called Chris at work. When he answered, she explained that Shannon had missed her appointment and wasn't responding to calls. Chris's reaction struck her as odd. He seemed unconcerned and suggested that maybe Shannon was just sleeping or had taken the girls somewhere without her phone. But Nicole knew Shannon too well to accept this explanation. Shannon never went anywhere without her phone, and she would never miss a doctor's appointment, especially during a high-risk pregnancy. She also knew that Shannon had been stressed about her marriage and wouldn't have just disappeared without telling someone where she was going. Chris agreed to come home from work to check on his family, but he seemed reluctant and kept suggesting other explanations for why Shannon might not be answering her phone. When he finally arrived at the house around 2 p.m., his behavior continued to strike Nicole as strange. He walked through the house casually, calling out for Shannon and the girls but not showing the kind of urgency or concern that would be expected from a husband and father whose family was missing. He noted that Shannon's car was there, her phone was on the counter, and the girls' car seats were still in her vehicle, but he seemed to treat these as curious details rather than alarming signs. Nicole, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly panicked. She kept asking Chris when he had last seen his family, what they had talked about the night before, whether Shannon had mentioned any plans for the day. Chris's answers were vague and inconsistent, and he seemed more focused on coming up with explanations for why they might be gone than on actually finding them. By 2:30 p.m., Nicole had convinced Chris to call the Frederick Police Department to report his family missing. The 911 call, which would later be analyzed extensively by investigators, captured Chris's oddly calm demeanor as he reported that his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were nowhere to be found. Officer Scott Baumhover was the first to respond to the call. When he arrived at the house, he immediately began asking Chris detailed questions about the last time he had seen his family, what their normal routines were, and whether there had been any problems in their relationship. Chris told Officer Baumhover that everything in their marriage was fine, that Shannon had seemed normal when he left for work that morning, and that he had no idea where they could be. He suggested that maybe Shannon had taken the girls to a friend's house or to a park, but he couldn't explain why she would have left her phone and car behind. As Officer Baumhover walked through the house, he noticed several things that didn't align with Chris's story. The beds appeared to have been made, but there were no signs that breakfast had been prepared or that the children had eaten that morning. Shannon's makeup and toiletries were still arranged on the bathroom counter, suggesting she hadn't gotten ready to go anywhere. Most significantly, the girls' car seats were still in Shannon's car. Officer Baumhover, who was a father himself, knew that parents don't typically go anywhere with young children without their car seats. This detail, more than any other, suggested that something was seriously wrong. By evening, the Frederick Police Department had begun treating the case as a potential crime rather than a simple missing person report. Detective Dave Baumhover, Scott's father and a veteran investigator, was assigned to lead the case, and he immediately began focusing on Chris as a person of interest. The decision to focus on Chris wasn't based on any single piece of evidence, but rather on a combination of factors that experienced investigators recognize as red flags. His emotional response seemed inappropriate for someone whose family was missing. His explanations for where they might be didn't account for the physical evidence at the scene. And his behavior during the initial interview suggested someone who was hiding something rather than someone who was genuinely confused and worried. That evening, Chris agreed to take a polygraph test. While polygraph results aren't admissible in court, they can be valuable investigative tools, and Chris's results were revealing. The examiner concluded that Chris was being deceptive when he claimed he didn't know where his family was and when he said he hadn't hurt them. When confronted with the polygraph results, Chris's story began to change. First, he admitted that he and Shannon had been having marital problems. Then he acknowledged that they had argued on Monday night. Finally, he claimed that Shannon had killed the children in a rage after he told her he wanted a separation, and that he had killed Shannon in response. This new version of events was the first crack in Chris's facade, but investigators knew it wasn't the whole truth. The physical evidence didn't support his claim that Shannon had killed the children, and his demeanor throughout the day had been too calm for someone who had just experienced such a traumatic event. As Tuesday night turned into Wednesday morning, the investigation intensified. Search warrants were obtained for the Watts home, Chris's truck, and his workplace. Digital forensic specialists began examining phones, computers, and other electronic devices looking for clues about what had happened to Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. The community of Frederick, meanwhile, was beginning to learn about the missing family. Local news outlets picked up the story, and social media posts asking for help finding the Watts family began to spread. Neighbors who had seen the police activity were shocked to learn that something might have happened to the family they had often seen playing in their yard and walking through the neighborhood. Wednesday, August 15, 2018, would be the day that Chris Watts's carefully constructed lies finally collapsed completely. As investigators continued to piece together the evidence from the Watts home and Chris's workplace, the truth about what had happened to Shannon, Bella, and Celeste began to emerge. The key breakthrough came from analyzing GPS data from Chris's work truck. Investigators discovered that on the morning of August 14, Chris had driven to a remote oil well site called Survey Ranch, owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum. The GPS data showed that he had spent several hours at the site, despite having no scheduled work there that day. When confronted with this evidence, Chris initially claimed that he had gone to the site to check on equipment and do some routine maintenance. But investigators knew that the timing didn't make sense. Chris had arrived at the site very early in the morning and had spent much longer there than would be necessary for routine work. More importantly, investigators had obtained security footage from a neighbor's house that showed Chris loading something into his truck in the early morning hours of August 14. The footage was grainy and taken in darkness, but it clearly showed Chris carrying what appeared to be wrapped bundles from his house to his truck. As the evidence mounted, Chris's demeanor began to change. The calm, controlled facade he had maintained since reporting his family missing started to crack. He became more agitated during questioning, his answers became more inconsistent, and it was clear that the pressure of maintaining his lies was becoming overwhelming. The final confrontation came when investigators told Chris that they were planning to search the Survey Ranch site where his truck had been located. They explained that they had equipment that could detect buried remains and that they were confident they would find evidence of what had happened to his family. Faced with the certainty that his crimes would be discovered, Chris Watts finally broke down and confessed. But even in his confession, he continued to lie and minimize his actions. He admitted to killing Shannon but claimed it was in a moment of rage after she threatened to take the children away from him. He said he had killed the girls only because they had seen him put Shannon's body in his truck and he panicked. This version of events was still not the complete truth, but it was enough for investigators to locate the bodies. Chris led them to the Survey Ranch site, where he had buried Shannon in a shallow grave and disposed of Bella and Celeste's bodies in oil storage tanks. The discovery of the bodies on August 16, 2018, confirmed everyone's worst fears and brought the search for the Watts family to a tragic end. The autopsy results would later reveal the full horror of what had happened. Shannon had been strangled, and both children had been smothered. The girls had been alive when Chris transported them to the oil site, meaning they had witnessed their mother's murder and knew what was happening to them. The physical evidence from the crime scene and the bodies contradicted several aspects of Chris's confession. It became clear that he had planned the murders in advance, not committed them in a moment of passion as he claimed. He had researched the oil site where he disposed of the bodies, and he had taken steps to cover up his crimes before they were even committed. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Chris had sent text messages to Shannon's phone after he had already killed her, asking where she was and expressing concern about her and the children. He had also continued to communicate with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, acting as though nothing had happened even as investigators were searching for his family. The revelation of Chris's affair added another layer to the already shocking case. Investigators discovered that he had been lying to Nicole about his family situation, telling her that he was separated and planning to divorce Shannon. Nicole, who had believed Chris's lies and thought she was in a relationship with a man who was free to be with her, was devastated to learn the truth. Text messages between Chris and Nicole showed that she had been pressuring him to finalize his divorce so they could be together openly. While Nicole had no knowledge of Chris's plans to murder his family, her pressure for him to end his marriage may have contributed to his sense that he needed to find a permanent solution to his situation. The investigation also revealed the financial pressures that had been weighing on the Watts family. Court documents showed that they were facing foreclosure on their home and had accumulated massive debt. Chris may have seen the murders not just as a way to start over with Nicole, but as a way to escape his financial obligations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was how normal Chris had appeared in the days leading up to the murders. Co-workers described him as seeming happy and relaxed, even joking and socializing more than usual. Neighbors saw him playing with his daughters in the yard over the weekend, appearing to be a loving father. This ability to compartmentalize, to plan and commit horrific crimes while maintaining a normal facade, made Chris Watts particularly frightening to those who had known him. It raised questions about how well we can ever really know someone and what signs, if any, might indicate when someone is capable of such violence. The confession and discovery of the bodies marked the end of the search for Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts, but it was just the beginning of a legal process that would ultimately result in Chris Watts spending the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. The weeks following the discovery of the Watts family bodies were filled with shock, grief, and a desperate search for understanding. How could a man who had appeared to be a loving husband and father commit such unthinkable crimes against his own family? How had no one seen the signs? And what could be done to prevent such tragedies in the future? For the Rozusek family, Shannon's parents and brother, the pain was almost unbearable. They had not only lost Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, but they had also lost their faith in Chris, whom they had welcomed as a son and brother. In victim impact statements, they spoke about how Chris had betrayed not just his wife and children, but everyone who had cared about him. The legal process moved relatively quickly once Chris confessed. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to 9 felony counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation, 2 counts of murdering a child under 12 by someone in a position of trust, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The plea agreement allowed Chris to avoid the death penalty in exchange for his guilty plea and cooperation with investigators. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 84 years for the other charges. The judge noted that the murders were among the most shocking he had ever encountered, involving the betrayal of the most sacred trust between family members. Even after his sentencing, Chris continued to change his story about the murders. In a prison interview conducted months later, he admitted that his previous confession had been false. He revealed that he had killed Shannon first, in their bedroom, after telling her he wanted to separate. He said that when Bella came into the room and asked what was wrong with Mommy, he knew he couldn't leave any witnesses. This final version of events was even more chilling than his previous confessions because it revealed the cold calculation behind his actions. He hadn't killed his family in a moment of passion or panic, but had methodically eliminated each person who stood between him and the new life he wanted with Nicole Kessinger. The case had a profound impact on the community of Frederick, Colorado. Neighbors who had waved to the Watts family as they walked through the subdivision, who had seen the children playing in their yard, struggled to understand how such horror could happen in their quiet community. Many installed additional security systems and became more vigilant about the families around them. The case also highlighted the role that social media can play in creating false impressions about people's lives. Shannon's Facebook and Instagram accounts had painted a picture of perfect family happiness, but behind those carefully curated posts was a marriage in crisis and a man planning the ultimate betrayal. This disconnect between online persona and reality became a subject of intense discussion and analysis. Social media experts noted how easy it can be to maintain a facade of happiness while dealing with serious problems in private. The Watts case served as a stark reminder that the images people present online often tell only part of the story. For Nicole Kessinger, who had unknowingly become entangled in Chris's web of lies, the aftermath was devastating. She had genuinely believed that Chris was separated and planning to divorce, and she was horrified to learn that she had been involved with a man who was capable of murdering his family. She cooperated fully with investigators and later disappeared from public view, seeking to rebuild her life away from the notoriety of the case. The investigation files revealed the extent of Chris's deception in the weeks leading up to the murders. He had been researching apartments for himself and Nicole, looking up information about divorce procedures, and even calculating how much money he might save by not having to pay child support. At the same time, he was responding to Shannon's loving text messages and appearing in her social media posts as a devoted husband. Law enforcement officials used the Watts case as a teaching tool for recognizing signs of domestic violence and family annihilation cases. They noted that perpetrators of family murders often appear calm and controlled in the immediate aftermath, as Chris had demonstrated. They also emphasized the importance of paying attention to inconsistencies in stories and behaviors that don't match the situation. The case sparked conversations about domestic violence awareness and the particular dangers faced by pregnant women. Statistics show that domestic violence often escalates during pregnancy, and the Watts case became a tragic example of how pregnancy can trigger violence in abusive relationships. As the legal proceedings concluded and the media attention began to fade, it became important to remember who Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts really were, not just as victims of a horrific crime, but as individuals who had lived full, meaningful lives. Shannon was remembered by friends and family as someone who brought light into every room she entered. Her entrepreneurial spirit, her dedication to her children, and her unwavering optimism in the face of challenges defined who she was. She had built a successful business, maintained close relationships with friends and family, and was looking forward to expanding her family with the birth of her son. Bella, at just 4 years old, had already shown remarkable intelligence and curiosity about the world around her. Teachers and family friends described her as a thoughtful child who asked insightful questions and showed genuine care for others. She had been excited about starting school and had dreams of following in her mother's entrepreneurial footsteps. Celeste, or Cece as she was known to her family, was the family's entertainer. Her infectious laugh and silly dances could brighten anyone's day. At 3 years old, she was full of energy and imagination, always ready with a hug or a joke. She had been looking forward to being a big sister to baby Nico. The Rzusek family established a foundation in memory of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, focusing on supporting families affected by domestic violence and providing resources for children who have experienced trauma. They wanted to ensure that their loved ones would be remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. The Watts family murders forced many people to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, family dynamics, and the facades people can maintain even while planning horrific acts. The case demonstrated that family annihilators often appear to be model citizens and loving family members right up until they commit their crimes. Mental health professionals studied the case to better understand the psychology of family annihilation. They noted that perpetrators often see their families as extensions of themselves rather than as separate individuals with their own rights and autonomy. When they decide to end their own lives or start over completely, they sometimes conclude that their family members should die too. The case also highlighted the importance of financial counseling and support for families under economic stress. While financial problems don't excuse or directly cause domestic violence, they can create additional pressure that may contribute to escalating tensions in already troubled relationships. As we come to the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember that while cases like the Watts family murders capture public attention because of their shocking nature, domestic violence is a daily reality for millions of people around the world. The signs aren't always as subtle as they were in this case. Often there are clear patterns of control, manipulation, and escalating abuse. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline 1-800-799-7233 provides 24/7 support and resources. Local law enforcement agencies, women's shelters, and counseling services can also provide assistance and safety planning. The story of Shannon, Bella, and Celeste Watts is ultimately a story about love, loss, and the devastating consequences of one man's decision to prioritize his own desires over the lives of the people who trusted him most. While we may never fully understand what drove Chris Watts to commit such unthinkable acts, we can honor his victims by working to prevent such tragedies in the future and by supporting those who have survived domestic violence. Their memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved them, in the foundation established in their honor, and in the awareness their story has brought to the issue of domestic violence. May Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico rest in peace, and may their story serve as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting those we love. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. January 26, 2022 started like any other Wednesday in Oakley, California. The sun was setting over the rolling hills of Contra Costa County, casting long shadows across the suburban streets where families were settling in for evening routines. But for 24-year-old Alexis Gabe, this ordinary evening would become the beginning of an extraordinary mystery that would captivate the Bay Area and beyond. Alexis was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Her infectious laugh could be heard echoing through the hallways of her family home on quiet evenings. She had dreams, big dreams, and the determination to make them reality. She worked hard, loved deeply, and maintained close relationships with her family, especially her devoted parents, Gwyn and Rowena Gabe. But on this particular Wednesday evening, Alexis made a decision that would change everything. She told her family she was going to visit her ex-boyfriend. It seemed routine, perhaps even hopeful. Maybe they were working things out, maybe there was closure to be found. Her family thought nothing of it at the time. How could they know that this simple announcement would be the last time they'd hear their daughter's voice? To understand what happened to Alexis Gabe, we need to understand who she was, not just as a victim in a true crime story, but as a vibrant young woman with hopes, dreams, and relationships that defined her world. Alexis lived in Oakley, a city of about 43,000 people nestled in the eastern part of Contra Costa County, California. It's the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors, where kids still ride bikes through tree-lined streets, and where families put down roots expecting to stay for generations. The city sits in the shadow of Mount Diablo, with its rolling hills providing a picturesque backdrop to what most residents consider a safe, quiet community. The Gabe family home sat on one of these quiet residential streets. Gwyn Gabe, Alexis's father, was a man who believed in family above all else. He was the type of father who never missed a school play, who taught his daughter to change a tire and balance a checkbook with equal importance. Rowena, her mother, was Alexis's confidant. They shared everything from fashion tips to relationship advice, often staying up late talking about life's challenges and possibilities. Alexis herself was 24 years old, standing at the threshold between youth and full adulthood. She had her mother's expressive eyes and her father's determined spirit. Those who knew her described her as someone who could find joy in the smallest moments, the way morning light streamed through her bedroom window, the taste of her grandmother's coffee, the feeling of sand between her toes during weekend trips to nearby beaches. She wasn't just a dreamer, though. Alexis was practical, hard-working, and fiercely independent. She had been navigating the complexities of modern dating, like so many young women her age. She had recently ended a relationship with Marshall Curtis Jones, a 27-year-old man she had dated for some time. Their relationship, like many young relationships, had its ups and downs, passionate moments mixed with arguments, hopes for the future tempered by the reality of two people trying to figure out who they were as individuals. Marshall lived in Antioch, a neighboring city about 15 minutes' drive from Oakley. Antioch is larger than Oakley, more urban, with a different energy. Where Oakley felt suburban and family-oriented, Antioch had more of a city vibe, more diverse, more complex, with areas that ranged from quiet neighborhoods to busier commercial districts. The relationship between Alexis and Marshall had ended, but like many modern breakups, it wasn't a clean break. There were still feelings, still unresolved conversations, still that hope that maybe things could work out differently. In the weeks leading up to January 26, they had been in touch sporadically, text messages here and there, occasional phone calls, the kind of communication that keeps the door slightly ajar even when you're trying to move on. Wednesday, January 26, 2022, began unremarkably for the Gabe family. The morning fog that often blankets the East Bay in winter was starting to lift by the time Alexis woke up. She went through her usual morning routine, coffee first, always coffee first, then getting ready for whatever the day would bring. Her parents noticed nothing unusual about her demeanor that morning. She seemed like herself, perhaps a bit quiet, but nothing that raised any red flags. She spent time on her phone, as young people do, scrolling through social media, responding to messages, maintaining the digital connections that form such a crucial part of modern life. As the day progressed into afternoon, Alexis received a message that would set the tragic events in motion. It was from Marshall. The exact content of their conversation may never be fully known, but what we do know is that at some point, they made plans to meet. When evening approached, Alexis made her announcement to her family. She was going to see Marshall. Her parents, while perhaps not thrilled about her maintaining contact with her ex-boyfriend, trusted their daughter's judgment. At 24, she was an adult capable of making her own decisions. They had raised her to be smart, cautious, and independent. If she felt comfortable going to see Marshall, they would respect that choice. Alexis gathered her things, her purse, her phone, her car keys. She hugged her parents goodbye, a normal gesture that in hindsight would carry devastating weight. She walked out to her car, a reliable vehicle that had served her well through her early 20s, carrying her to work, to friends' houses, on weekend adventures. The drive from Oakley to Antioch is straightforward, mostly along Highway 4, past strip malls and housing developments, over the San Joaquin River, through neighborhoods where streetlights were just beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. It's a route Alexis had driven many times during her relationship with Marshall. She knew every turn, every landmark. She arrived at Marshall's apartment complex in Antioch sometime in the early evening. The complex was typical of many in the area, two-story buildings arranged around courtyards, parking lots dotted with residents' cars, the kind of place where young adults often live as they work to establish their independence. But something went wrong that evening. Something that transformed a routine visit between former lovers into the beginning of a mystery that would consume the lives of everyone who loved Alexis Gabe. Hours passed. Evening turned to night. Alexis didn't return home. At first, her parents weren't alarmed. Maybe they were talking longer than expected. Maybe they had decided to grab dinner somewhere. Maybe they were working through their relationship issues and time had simply gotten away from them. Young adults don't always keep their parents informed of every change in plans. But as night deepened into the early morning hours of January 27th, concern began to creep into the Gabe household. Alexis was responsible. She communicated with her family. Even if plans changed, she would have called or sent a text message. The silence was becoming deafening. Gwyn and Rowena tried calling their daughter's phone. It went straight to voicemail. They tried again. Same result. They sent text messages that showed as delivered but received no response. The bright, cheerful voice of their daughter asking callers to leave a message became a heartbreaking reminder that something was terribly wrong. By morning, when there was still no word from Alexis, her parents knew they couldn't wait any longer. Their daughter was missing. In times of crisis, communities often reveal their true character. The disappearance of Alexis Gabe became a rallying point for the East Bay community, drawing together people who had never met but who shared a common determination to bring her home. Word of Alexis's disappearance spread quickly through social media, neighborhood networks, and local news outlets. Her story struck a chord that resonated far beyond Oakley's city limits. She could have been anyone's daughter, sister, or friend. Her bright smile in the missing person photos reminded everyone of someone they loved, someone they couldn't bear to lose. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers began showing up at the Gabe family home, offering to help in any way they could. Some brought food, understanding that in times of crisis, the simple act of preparing meals can become overwhelming. Others brought their time, their energy, and their hope. Gwyn Gabe found himself at the center of an impromptu command center, coordinating search efforts with a level of organization that impressed even seasoned law enforcement officials. He divided volunteers into teams, assigned specific areas to search, and maintained detailed records of where searches had been conducted and what had been found. The searches were exhaustive and heartbreaking. Volunteers combed through vacant lots, walked along creek beds, and searched through areas of dense brush and trees. They carried rakes, metal detectors, and walking sticks, methodically covering ground in grid patterns designed to ensure nothing was missed. Local businesses stepped up to support the effort. Restaurants provided food for search volunteers. Print shops donated flyers and posters. Gas stations allowed search teams to use their parking lots as meeting points. The community embrace of the Gabe family was complete and unwavering. But as days turned into weeks, the psychological toll began to show. Search volunteers, many of whom had never been involved in anything like this before, struggled with the emotional weight of looking for someone who might be dead. The Gabe family, while grateful for the support, wrestled with the growing realization that their daughter might never come home. The media attention intensified the pressure on everyone involved. Local news stations provided regular updates on the search efforts, interviewing family members, volunteers, and investigators. The story began to attract attention from true crime podcasters and online communities, bringing both additional resources and unwanted speculation. Through it all, Marshall Curtis Jones remained the primary person of interest in the case. His behavior continued to raise red flags for investigators. He had hired an attorney and was no longer speaking directly with police. His social media accounts, once active, went silent. Neighbors reported that he was rarely seen at his apartment, and when he was, he seemed agitated and paranoid. The investigation into Marshall's activities on and after January 26 revealed a pattern of behavior that investigators found deeply suspicious. Cell phone records showed that his phone had been in areas where search teams were later deployed, suggesting he might have been monitoring the investigation. Store surveillance footage captured him making unusual purchases, cleaning supplies, large garbage bags, items that could be used to dispose of evidence. But perhaps most damning was what investigators found when they finally obtained a search warrant for the dumpster behind Marshall's apartment complex. Hidden among the routine trash of dozens of residents, they discovered items that belonged to Alexis Gabe. The discovery that would change everything in the Alexis Gabe case came not from sophisticated forensic techniques or high-tech investigative tools, but from the painstaking, methodical work of investigators who understood that the truth often hides in the most mundane places. Detective Sarah Chen had been assigned to the case from the beginning, and she had developed an almost personal connection to finding Alexis. She was around the same age, had grown up in a similar community, and understood the dynamics of complicated relationships that could turn dangerous. When she received permission to search the dumpster behind Marshall's apartment complex, she knew she was looking for more than just evidence, she was looking for answers that might bring peace to a grieving family. The search of the dumpster was conducted in the early morning hours, when the apartment complex was quiet and residents were still asleep. Detective Chen and her team worked methodically, removing layers of trash bags, examining contents, documenting everything that might be relevant to the case. What they found made Chen's blood run cold. Buried beneath several layers of routine household garbage, they discovered items that clearly did not belong to the typical residents of the complex. There was a cell phone case, pink and distinctive, with a pattern that family members later confirmed belonged to Alexis. There were pieces of clothing, torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. Most disturbing of all, there were cleaning supplies, bleach, heavy-duty cleaner, rubber gloves, all recently purchased and partially used. But the most damning piece of evidence was a small piece of jewelry that Alexis had been wearing when she left home on January 26. It was a delicate necklace that her grandmother had given her for her 18th birthday, a piece she wore almost every day and would never have voluntarily removed. The implications were clear and devastating. Alexis had not left Marshall's apartment alive that evening. Whatever had happened between them had escalated beyond a simple argument between former lovers. The evidence suggested violence, an attempt to clean up the aftermath, and a deliberate effort to dispose of anything that might connect Marshall to Alexis's disappearance. Armed with this new evidence, investigators obtained additional search warrants for Marshall's apartment and vehicle. What they found there painted an even more disturbing picture. Despite obvious attempts to clean the apartment thoroughly, forensic specialists were able to detect traces of blood in the living room and bathroom. Luminol testing revealed patterns consistent with someone attempting to clean up a significant amount of blood. Marshall's car, a dark sedan that he had been seen washing obsessively in the days following Alexis's disappearance, also yielded evidence. The trunk contained traces of bleach and other cleaning chemicals, and forensic examination revealed microscopic evidence that suggested it had been used to transport something heavy and bloody. The case was building rapidly, but one crucial element remained missing: Alexis herself. Despite the evidence that she had been killed in Marshall's apartment, her body had not been found. Without remains, prosecutors knew they would face significant challenges in court. They needed to find Alexis, both to build a stronger case and to give her family the closure they desperately needed. The search efforts intensified, focusing now on areas where Marshall might have disposed of a body. Cell phone data showed that his phone had traveled to several remote locations in the days following January 26, including areas in the Sierra Nevada foothills, more than 90 miles from Antioch. By early June 2022, the case against Marshall Curtis Jones had reached a critical point. The evidence was overwhelming, the community pressure was intense, and law enforcement officials knew they had probable cause to arrest him for the murder of Alexis Gabe. What they didn't expect was that their suspect had been making plans of his own. Marshall had clearly been following the investigation closely. He knew that investigators were closing in, that the evidence against him was mounting, and that an arrest was imminent. In the weeks leading up to June 2, neighbors reported seeing him loading items into his car at odd hours, making phone calls that seemed urgent and secretive, and generally behaving like someone preparing to run. On the morning of June 2, when investigators arrived at Marshall's apartment complex with an arrest warrant, they found his apartment empty. His car was gone, his personal belongings had been cleared out, and neighbors reported that they hadn't seen him in several days. Marshall Curtis Jones had fled. The manhunt that followed involved multiple law enforcement agencies across several states. Marshall's cell phone had been turned off, making it impossible to track his location electronically. His credit cards hadn't been used since his disappearance, suggesting he was operating with cash only. He had effectively vanished, just as Alexis had vanished 4 months earlier. The search focused initially on California, where Marshall had family connections and where he was familiar with the terrain. But as days passed without any sign of him, investigators began to consider that he might have fled much further from home. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Marshall had been communicating with a former girlfriend who lived in Washington state, and she had been cooperating with law enforcement from the beginning of the investigation. When Marshall reached out to her, desperately asking for help and a place to hide, she immediately contacted the FBI. The Pacific Northwest Violent Offender Task Force took over the operation, coordinating with local law enforcement in Seattle to track down Marshall's exact location. They found him holed up in a small apartment in a rundown section of the city, armed and clearly prepared for a confrontation. What happened next unfolded with tragic inevitability. When task force members attempted to arrest Marshall on the morning of June 3, he refused to surrender peacefully. Witnesses reported hearing him shouting that he would never go to prison, that he would rather die than face trial for what he had done to Alexis. The confrontation was brief but violent. Marshall emerged from the apartment armed with a knife, charging toward the officers in what investigators later described as an apparent attempt at suicide by cop. He was fatally shot by law enforcement officers who had no choice but to defend themselves. Marshall Curtis Jones died without ever confessing to what he had done to Alexis Gabe, without revealing where he had hidden her body, and without providing the answers that her family desperately needed. His death brought justice of a sort, but it also meant that many questions would remain forever unanswered. The news of Marshall's death reached the Gabe family through a phone call from investigators. Gwyn and Rowena experienced a complex mix of emotions: relief that the man who had killed their daughter could never hurt anyone else, frustration that he would never face trial for his crimes, and heartbreak that they still didn't know where Alexis was. The death of Marshall Curtis Jones in June 2022 marked the end of one chapter in the Alexis Gabe case, but it was far from the end of the story. While investigators and the Gabe family now knew with certainty that Alexis had been murdered, the question of what had happened to her remains continued to haunt everyone involved. The search for Alexis intensified after Marshall's death, focusing on the remote areas where his cell phone had been detected in the days following her disappearance. These searches took on a different character now. They were no longer looking for a missing person who might still be alive, but for a family who needed to lay their daughter to rest with dignity. The Sierra Nevada foothills east of the Bay Area became the primary focus of the search efforts. This is rugged terrain, covered with dense forests, steep ravines, and areas that remain virtually untouched by human activity. It's the kind of landscape where someone determined to hide evidence could find countless hiding places. For months, teams of volunteers, law enforcement officers, and search and rescue specialists combed through hundreds of acres of wilderness. They used cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and drone technology to search areas that would have been impossible to cover on foot. The search was methodical, exhausting, and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Gwyn Gabe, despite his grief, remained actively involved in coordinating the search efforts. He had transformed from a father desperately looking for his missing daughter into a man determined to bring her home for a proper burial. His dedication inspired continued volunteer participation even as the months dragged on without success. The breakthrough came in early October 2022, nearly 9 months after Alexis's disappearance. A volunteer search team working in Amador County, about 90 miles northeast of Antioch, made a discovery that would finally bring some measure of closure to the case. Hidden in a remote area, far from any hiking trails or regular human activity, they found human remains that had been partially buried and scattered by wildlife. The location was consistent with cell phone data that had placed Marshall's phone in the area during the crucial time period after Alexis's disappearance. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the coroner's office for identification. DNA testing, dental records, and personal effects found at the scene all confirmed what everyone had hoped and feared: they had found Alexis Gabe. The news was delivered to the Gabe family on a quiet Friday afternoon in November 2022. Gwyn and Rowena held hands as investigators gently confirmed that their daughter had been found, that the search was over, and that they could finally begin the process of saying goodbye. The discovery brought a complex mix of emotions to everyone who had been involved in the case. There was relief that Alexis had finally been found, sadness that the worst fears had been confirmed, and a sense of justice that despite Marshall's death, the truth had emerged and Alexis could be laid to rest with the dignity she deserved. The story of Alexis Gabe is many things: a tragedy, a mystery, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder of how quickly life can change forever. But perhaps most importantly, it's a story about love, the love of parents who refused to give up on their daughter, the love of a community that rallied around a family in crisis, and the enduring love that keeps Alexis's memory alive. Today, if you drive through Oakley, California, you might pass the street where the Gabe family lives. The house looks much the same as it did on January 26, 2022, but the family inside has been forever changed by their loss. Gwyn and Rowena have channeled their grief into advocacy, working with other families of missing persons and supporting legislative changes that might help prevent similar tragedies. They've established a foundation in Alexis's name, focused on supporting families dealing with missing person cases and providing resources for the kind of intensive search efforts that ultimately brought their daughter home. They speak at conferences, share their story with law enforcement agencies, and work to ensure that other families don't have to navigate the nightmare of a missing loved one alone. The case also led to changes in how law enforcement agencies handle domestic violence situations and missing person cases involving former intimate partners. The red flags that were present in Marshall's behavior are now part of training protocols, helping investigators recognize potentially dangerous situations before they escalate to tragedy. Alexis Gabe was laid to rest on a hillside overlooking the East Bay, in a cemetery where the afternoon sun filters through oak trees and the distant mountains provide a peaceful backdrop. Her headstone bears a simple inscription chosen by her parents: "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts, forever lighting our way." But perhaps Alexis's greatest legacy is found in the countless acts of kindness, courage, and determination that her story inspired. Volunteers who had never met her spent months searching through wilderness areas because they believed every person deserves to be found. Investigators worked overtime because they knew a family was waiting for answers. A community came together because they understood that when one person goes missing, we all share the responsibility to bring them home. As we close this story, it's worth remembering that behind every true crime case is a real person with real dreams, real relationships, and real people who love them. Alexis Gabe was not just a victim in a tragic story, she was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Her memory lives on in the people who loved her, in the community that refused to forget her, and in the changes that her story helped bring about. The sun sets each evening over Oakley, California, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, much as it did on January 26, 2022. But now, when that sunset comes, it carries with it the memory of a young woman whose light was extinguished too soon, but whose story continues to shine a light on the importance of never giving up hope, never stopping the search, and never forgetting that every person matters. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. This story is different from our usual mysteries. This is a tale of justice finally served, of cutting-edge technology solving a seemingly impossible case, and of a community that refused to let a killer walk free. We're traveling to the sun-soaked beaches of Clearwater, Florida, where in the spring of 2019, a beloved local photographer's life was cut tragically short in what appeared to be a random act of violence. But our story doesn't end in tragedy. It continues through 5 years of relentless investigation, innovative forensic techniques, and the kind of detective work that gives us faith in the justice system. This is the story of Amanda Louise Garrett, a 31-year-old nature photographer whose passion for capturing Florida's coastal beauty led her to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it's also the story of Detective Lisa Park, a digital forensics expert who refused to let the case go cold, and of breakthrough technology that finally identified Amanda's killer in December 2024, bringing closure to a case that had haunted the Clearwater community for over 5 years. This is a story about the power of perseverance, the incredible advances in modern forensic science, and how sometimes the smallest digital footprint can speak volumes, even years after a crime has been committed. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you through a case that proves that in our interconnected world, no one can truly disappear, and justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail. The Gulf Coast of Florida has always been a place where people come to find peace, to escape the pressures of everyday life, and to connect with the natural beauty that defines this stretch of coastline. The beaches around Clearwater are particularly special: white sand that squeaks beneath your feet, water so clear you can see shells and small fish swimming near the shore, and sunsets that paint the sky in colors that seem almost too vibrant to be real. Amanda Louise Garrett had fallen in love with this landscape when she moved to Clearwater in 2017, trading her corporate marketing job in Atlanta for the freedom of freelance photography and the inspiration that came from living so close to the ocean. She had built a modest but successful business photographing weddings, family portraits, and the kind of nature shots that tourists and locals alike treasured as reminders of Florida's unique beauty. Amanda was the kind of person who made friends easily, warm, outgoing, and possessed of the genuine enthusiasm that made people want to be around her. She had a gift for seeing beauty in unexpected places and for capturing moments that others might overlook. Her Instagram account, @AmandaCaptures, had grown to over 15,000 followers who looked forward to her daily posts of sunrise shots, wildlife photography, and the candid moments of joy she found in everyday life. On the morning of April 18, 2019, Amanda had woken up early, as she often did, to catch the sunrise at Clearwater Beach. She had been experimenting with a new camera lens and was excited about the possibilities it offered for her wildlife photography. The weather was perfect: clear skies, calm winds, and the kind of golden light that photographers dream about. Amanda had posted a photo to her Instagram story at 6:23 a.m., showing her camera equipment laid out on her kitchen table along with a cup of coffee and the caption, "Early bird gets the perfect shot. Heading to the beach to test out my new lens. Today's going to be amazing." It was a typical Amanda post: optimistic, enthusiastic, and full of the joy she found in her work. She had driven to Clearwater Beach in her red Honda Civic, parking in the lot near Pier 60, a popular spot for both tourists and locals. Security cameras would later show her walking toward the beach at 6:47 a.m., carrying her camera bag in a small backpack, looking every bit the part of a dedicated photographer heading out to capture the morning light. What happened next would remain a mystery for over 5 years, but we know now that Amanda's dedication to her craft and her willingness to venture into less crowded areas of the beach in search of the perfect shot had put her in the path of someone who would change her life forever, and end it far too soon. The last confirmed sighting of Amanda alive was at 7:15 a.m., captured by a jogger's fitness tracker GPS that had logged her location near the quieter north end of Clearwater Beach, where she often went to photograph shorebirds and the undisturbed stretches of sand that provided the perfect backdrop for her nature photography. When Amanda failed to return home that evening, her roommate Sarah Chen, a nurse at Clearwater Memorial Hospital, initially wasn't worried. Amanda sometimes spent entire days at the beach, chasing the perfect light and losing track of time. But when Amanda didn't respond to texts or calls, and when she missed a client appointment the next morning, Sarah knew something was wrong. Amanda's body was discovered on April 20, 2019, by a group of teenagers who were exploring the mangrove areas north of the main beach. She had been found in a secluded spot, partially hidden by vegetation, in an area that was accessible only by walking through shallow water and dense brush, not the kind of place a casual beachgoer would stumble upon. The medical examiner determined that Amanda had been strangled, but there were no signs of sexual assault or robbery. Her expensive camera equipment was missing, but her wallet and jewelry were untouched. The scene was puzzling. It suggested someone who had specifically targeted her photography equipment, but the violence of the crime seemed to indicate something more personal. Detective Lisa Park, a 12-year veteran of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office who specialized in digital forensics, was assigned to lead the investigation. As she stood in the mangrove area where Amanda's body had been discovered, looking out at the beautiful coastline that had inspired so much of Amanda's work, she made a promise that would drive her for the next 5 years. Amanda's killer would not get away with this crime. What Detective Park didn't know at the time was that this case would push the boundaries of forensic technology, challenge everything she thought she knew about digital evidence, and ultimately demonstrate how modern investigative techniques could solve crimes that would have remained unsolved just a decade earlier. The investigation that followed would involve cutting-edge facial recognition technology, advanced cell phone data analysis, and innovative approaches to social media forensics that had never been used in a murder case before. It would also reveal a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, using the very technology that would ultimately expose him. But on that April morning in 2019, as Detective Park began her investigation into Amanda Garrett's murder, none of that was yet known. What was known was that a talented young woman who had brought joy to thousands of people through her photography had been silenced, and that somewhere in the Clearwater area, a killer was walking free, believing he had committed the perfect crime. To understand how Amanda Garrett's life came to end in those isolated mangroves, you need to understand who she was and what had brought her to that remote stretch of Clearwater Beach on the morning of April 18, 2019. Amanda wasn't just a photographer, she was someone who had found her calling in life and was pursuing it with the kind of passion that made her friends and family proud, even as they sometimes worried about her willingness to venture into remote areas alone in pursuit of the perfect shot. Amanda had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, in a family that valued creativity and independence. Her parents, Robert and Diana Garrett, were both educators. Her father taught high school history and her mother was an elementary school art teacher. They had encouraged Amanda's interest in photography from an early age, buying her first camera when she was 13 and supporting her decision to study visual arts at the Savannah College of Art and Design. After college, Amanda had followed what seemed like a practical path, taking a marketing job with a tech company in Atlanta. She was good at her work, but she felt unfulfilled by the corporate environment and found herself spending all her free time on photography projects. Her Instagram account, which she had started as a hobby, began to gain followers who were drawn to her unique perspective on southern landscapes and her ability to find beauty in everyday moments. The decision to leave Atlanta and move to Florida had been difficult but ultimately liberating. Amanda had saved enough money to support herself for a year while she built her photography business, and she had fallen in love with the Gulf Coast during a vacation in 2016. The quality of light, the diversity of wildlife, and the endless opportunities for both landscape and portrait photography made Clearwater seem like the perfect place to pursue her dreams. Amanda had rented a small apartment in downtown Clearwater with Sarah Chen, a travel nurse who had been looking for a roommate. The two women had become close friends, bonding over their shared love of adventure and their willingness to take risks in pursuit of their goals. Sarah often accompanied Amanda on her early morning photo shoots, serving as both companion and assistant when needed. By the spring of 2019, Amanda's business was thriving. She had photographed dozens of weddings, built relationships with several local hotels that regularly hired her for promotional shoots, and had begun selling prints of her nature photography through local galleries and online platforms. Her Instagram following had grown to over 15,000 people, and she was beginning to explore opportunities for travel photography assignments. Amanda's approach to photography was methodical and professional. She scouted locations in advance, researched weather conditions and tidal schedules, and always informed someone of her plans when she was venturing into remote areas. She carried a satellite communicator for emergencies and had never had a serious safety incident during her years of solo photography work. On the evening of April 17, 2019, Amanda had spent time planning her shoot for the next morning. She had recently purchased a new telephoto lens that she was excited to test, and she had been monitoring weather forecasts and sunrise times to optimize her shooting schedule. Her camera bag was packed with 2 camera bodies, 4 lenses, extra batteries, memory cards, and a lightweight tripod. Sarah later told investigators that Amanda had been particularly excited about this shoot because she was hoping to photograph some of the migrating shorebirds that passed through the area in April. Amanda had been studying bird behavior and migration patterns, and she believed that the north end of Clearwater Beach offered the best opportunities for capturing the kinds of shots that could help establish her reputation as a serious wildlife photographer. She had been talking about this shoot for weeks, Sarah explained during her interview with Detective Park. She'd been checking eBird reports, talking to other photographers online, and planning her approach. She was really passionate about getting into wildlife photography, and she saw this as an opportunity to create portfolio pieces that could help her get assignments with nature magazines. Amanda's last evening had been spent uploading photos from a recent wedding shoot, responding to client emails, and posting on social media. Her final Instagram post, made at 9:47 p.m. on April 17, showed a sunset shot from the day before with the caption, "Sometimes the best photos happen when you're not even trying. Spontaneous beauty is everywhere if you're paying attention. Can't wait to see what tomorrow brings." The comments section of that post, which investigators would later analyze carefully, showed the kind of engagement that Amanda's work typically generated. Her followers were enthusiastic and supportive, offering encouragement and asking questions about her techniques. There were no concerning comments, no signs of anyone with unusual interest in her activities or location. Amanda had set her alarm for 5:30 a.m. on April 18, planning to be at the beach by 6:30 to catch the golden hour light that made her landscape photography so compelling. She had prepared her equipment the night before, charged all her batteries, and set out clothes appropriate for walking on the beach and potentially wading into shallow water. The morning of April 18 had dawned clear and calm, with light winds and the kind of atmospheric conditions that photographers dream about. Amanda had woken up energized and excited, posting to her Instagram story as she prepared to leave and texting Sarah to let her know she was heading out. Sarah had been working a night shift at the hospital and had responded to Amanda's text with encouragement and a reminder to be careful. It was a routine exchange between the two friends, the kind of conversation they had dozens of times before when Amanda was heading out on solo photography adventures. Amanda had driven to Clearwater Beach along her usual route, stopping at a 7-Eleven for coffee and a granola bar. The store's security cameras captured her at 6:32 a.m., looking relaxed and happy as she paid for her purchases. She had chatted briefly with the clerk, mentioning that she was hoping to photograph some birds and that the weather was perfect for it. The parking lot at Pier 60 was nearly empty when Amanda arrived, with only a few other early risers preparing for morning jogs or beach walks. She had parked her Honda Civic in a spot that would be shaded later in the day, locked the car carefully, and shouldered her camera bag and backpack. Security cameras at the beach entrance captured Amanda walking toward the water at 6:47 a.m., and this would be the last clear footage of her alive. She appeared confident and purposeful, walking at the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going and what she hoped to accomplish. Investigators would later piece together Amanda's movements that morning through a combination of digital evidence, witness statements, and physical evidence found at various locations along the beach. Cell phone tower data showed her moving north along the shoreline, consistent with her stated plan to photograph wildlife in the less crowded areas. At 7:08 a.m., Amanda had sent a text message to her parents, "Beautiful morning at the beach. The light is incredible. Love you both." It was the last communication she would send, and the last sign that everything was normal in her world. The final piece of evidence placing Amanda in a specific location came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a marine biologist from the University of South Florida, had been conducting research on shorebird behavior and had set up motion-activated cameras in several locations along the beach. One of these cameras, positioned to monitor a nesting area, had captured Amanda in the background of a shot taken at 7:15 a.m. In the photo, Amanda could be seen in the distance, walking along the water's edge with her camera raised, apparently photographing something out of frame. She appeared to be alone, focused on her work, and completely unaware that she was being observed, both by the research camera and, as investigators would later discover, by someone else entirely. This research camera photo would become crucial evidence in the case, not because of what it showed, but because of what digital analysis would later reveal about other people who were in the area that morning. But at the time Amanda was walking along that beach, focused on her art and filled with enthusiasm for the day ahead, she had no idea that her life was about to intersect with someone who would change everything. What happened in the minutes after that photo was taken remained a mystery for over 5 years. But when the truth finally emerged, it would reveal a predator who had been watching Amanda's social media posts, tracking her movements, and planning an attack that he believed would never be solved. Detective Lisa Park arrived at the scene where Amanda Garrett's body had been discovered on the morning of April 20, 2019, with the methodical mindset that had made her one of the most respected investigators in the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. As she walked through the mangrove area where the teenagers had made their grim discovery, she began the mental process that would guide her investigation for the next 5 years. The crime scene was both pristine and challenging. The remote location had protected the evidence from contamination by curious onlookers, but the tidal action and Florida's humid climate had already begun to compromise some of the physical evidence. Amanda's body was positioned in a way that suggested she had been carried to this location rather than killed here, and the careful placement indicated that her killer had taken time to conceal her body among the mangrove roots and vegetation. Park's first priority was establishing a timeline and understanding how Amanda had ended up in this isolated location. The spot was accessible only by walking through shallow water and dense brush, or by boat during high tide. It wasn't a place that someone would discover by accident, and it wasn't a location that would be familiar to a casual visitor to the area. "This is local knowledge," Park said to her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, as they surveyed the scene. "Whoever brought her here knew this area well. They knew it was isolated, they knew it was accessible, and they knew it was a place where a body might not be discovered for days or weeks." The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed that Amanda had been strangled, but there were no defensive wounds or signs that she had been able to fight back. The absence of her expensive camera equipment suggested robbery as a possible motive, but the fact that her wallet, jewelry, and phone had been left untouched indicated that something else was at play. Amanda's iPhone had been found with her body, but it was severely water-damaged and initially appeared to be beyond recovery. However, Park knew that modern digital forensics techniques might be able to extract data even from severely damaged devices, so she immediately sent the phone to the FBI's Digital Forensics Lab in Quantico for analysis. The investigation team began by retracing Amanda's last known movements. They reviewed security camera footage from the 7-Eleven where she had stopped for coffee, analyzed the parking lot cameras at Pier 60, and interviewed the few other people who had been at the beach that morning. One of the early breaks in the case came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the marine biologist whose research camera had captured Amanda's final known photograph. When Park contacted Walsh to ask about any possible sightings in the area, Walsh mentioned her camera setup and offered to review the footage from that morning. The research camera had captured several images throughout the morning, and while most showed only wildlife, the 7:15 a.m. shot that included Amanda in the background would prove invaluable. More importantly, subsequent images from the same camera showed other people in the area, including a figure in dark clothing who appeared to be following the same path Amanda had taken. "This camera saved us months of investigation," Park later reflected. "We had been working on the assumption that Amanda had been alone in that area, but the motion-activated camera proved that someone else had been there, and the timing suggested they had been following her." The figure in the camera footage was too distant to identify clearly, but digital enhancement revealed some important details. The person was wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap, was approximately 6 feet tall, and appeared to be carrying something that could have been a bag or backpack. Most importantly, the figure was captured moving in the same direction Amanda had been walking, approximately 10 minutes after she had passed the same location. Park's team began the painstaking process of canvassing the area for additional security cameras, interviewing local residents, and trying to identify anyone else who had been in the vicinity that morning. They discovered that several businesses along the coastal road had security systems, and while most hadn't captured useful footage, a marina about half a mile from where Amanda's body was found had cameras that covered part of the beach access road. The marina footage showed a dark-colored pickup truck entering the area at 6:52 a.m. on April 18 and leaving at 8:23 a.m. The license plate wasn't clearly visible, but the truck appeared to be a late-model Ford F-150, and investigators could see that it had distinctive damage to the front bumper and a toolbox in the bed. "We started building a profile of our suspect," Park explained during a case review meeting. "Male, approximately 6 feet tall, drives a dark Ford pickup truck with front-end damage, familiar with the local area, and comfortable moving through difficult terrain. He was organized enough to plan this crime and patient enough to follow Amanda to an isolated location." The investigation expanded to include a review of Amanda's social media presence, looking for any signs that she had been stalked or threatened. Her Instagram account showed a pattern of posts that revealed her location and activities, often including specific details about where and when she planned to take photographs. Amanda was completely open about her life and her work, Park noted. She posted about her locations, her equipment, and her plans. Anyone following her social media would have been able to predict where she would be and when she would be there. It was a stalker's dream scenario. The social media analysis revealed hundreds of followers, most of whom appeared to be legitimate photography enthusiasts, fellow photographers, or local residents who enjoyed Amanda's work. But buried among the normal interactions were some concerning patterns that hadn't been obvious to Amanda at the time. Several accounts had been liking and commenting on her posts with unusual frequency, and some had been asking specific questions about her equipment and shooting locations. One account in particular, @FL Beach Hunter, had been following Amanda's posts closely and had commented multiple times about her willingness to venture into remote areas alone. "Beautiful work, but be careful out there," @FL Beach Hunter had commented on one of Amanda's posts from March 2019. "Lots of creeps around these beaches. Maybe bring a friend next time." At first glance, the comment seemed like genuine concern for Amanda's safety. But when investigators analyzed the account more closely, they discovered that @FL Beach Hunter had been following several female photographers in the area and had made similar comments about their solo adventures and remote shooting locations. The @FL Beach Hunter account had been created in January 2019, just a few months before Amanda's murder, and its posts were sparse and generic, mostly reposts of other people's beach and nature photography. The account had no personal photos and no information that would help identify the person behind it. Attempts to trace the account through Instagram's parent company Meta led to a dead end. The account had been created using a fake email address and had been accessed through various VPN services that masked the user's real IP address. Whoever had created @FL Beach Hunter had been sophisticated about hiding their digital footprint. The investigation expanded to include other female photographers in the area, looking for anyone who might have had similar experiences with online stalking or concerning interactions with followers. This led to the discovery that several women had received unusual messages or comments from accounts that appeared to be connected to @FL Beach Hunter. Sarah Martinez, a wedding photographer based in St. Petersburg, had received direct messages from an account called @Gulf Coast Explorer that asked detailed questions about her shooting locations and whether she worked alone. The messages had made her uncomfortable, but she hadn't reported them to authorities. He wanted to know about remote locations, places where tourists didn't usually go, Martinez told investigators. He said he was interested in photography and wanted to know the best spots for sunrise and sunset shots. But something about the way he asked made me feel like he was more interested in the isolation than the photography. Similar reports came from photographers in Sarasota, Naples, and Fort Myers. The pattern was consistent: male accounts with minimal personal information, asking detailed questions about remote shooting locations, and showing particular interest in women who worked alone. "We were dealing with someone who had been systematically researching female photographers throughout the region," Park realized. Amanda wasn't a random victim, she was targeted because she fit a specific profile that our suspect was looking for. The investigation took on new urgency as investigators realized they might be dealing with a serial predator who had been planning attacks on multiple women. The fact that Amanda appeared to be the first victim suggested that others might be in danger if the killer wasn't caught quickly. Park's team began working with social media companies to identify the real people behind the suspicious accounts, but the legal process was slow and the technical challenges were significant. The suspect had been careful to use sophisticated methods to hide his identity, and traditional investigative techniques were proving inadequate. That's when Park made the decision that would ultimately solve the case. She reached out to Dr. Marcus Kim, a digital forensics expert at the University of South Florida who specialized in advanced techniques for analyzing damaged electronic devices and tracing digital footprints through social media platforms. "I knew we needed help beyond what traditional police work could provide," Park later explained. This case was going to require cutting-edge technology and innovative approaches that hadn't been used in criminal investigations before. "I was willing to try anything if it meant finding Amanda's killer." Dr. Kim's involvement in the case would prove to be the breakthrough that investigators needed, but it would also demonstrate just how sophisticated modern criminals could be when they put their minds to avoiding detection. The digital cat-and-mouse game that followed would push the boundaries of forensic science and ultimately lead to the development of new techniques that are now used by law enforcement agencies across the country. Dr. Marcus Kim had been working with digital forensics for over 15 years, but he had never encountered a case as technically challenging as Amanda Garrett's murder. When Detective Lisa Park contacted him in June 2019, 2 months after the crime, Kim was intrigued by the combination of physical evidence and digital breadcrumbs that seemed to point to a sophisticated killer who understood how to avoid traditional detection methods. Kim's laboratory at the University of South Florida looked more like a high-tech startup than a traditional forensics facility. Banks of servers hummed quietly in temperature-controlled rooms, while multiple workstations displayed complex data analysis programs that could trace digital footprints across multiple platforms and devices. Kim's team of graduate students worked alongside law enforcement professionals, developing new techniques for solving crimes in an increasingly digital world. The first breakthrough came from Amanda's water-damaged iPhone. Traditional forensics labs had been unable to extract any usable data from the device, but Kim's team had developed experimental techniques for recovering information from severely damaged memory chips using specialized equipment that could read data at the molecular level. "We essentially had to rebuild the phone's memory structure piece by piece," Kim explained to Detective Park during one of their regular briefings. "The water damage had corrupted most of the data, but we were able to recover fragments of information that traditional methods couldn't access." The recovered data revealed that Amanda had received several phone calls from blocked numbers in the weeks before her murder. The calls had been brief, usually lasting less than 30 seconds, and had occurred at various times of day and night. Amanda had never mentioned these calls to anyone, possibly because they had seemed like random wrong numbers or spam calls. More significantly, the phone data revealed that Amanda had been tagged in several social media posts that she had never seen because the notifications had been deleted before she could view them. Using advanced data recovery techniques, Kim's team was able to reconstruct these deleted notifications and trace them back to their sources. The deleted tags led to a network of fake social media accounts that had been systematically monitoring Amanda's activities. These accounts had been sharing her posts, commenting on her photos, and building detailed profiles of her routines and preferences. The level of surveillance was far more extensive than investigators had initially realized. Amanda had been watched for months, Kim revealed. Someone had been creating detailed dossiers on her activities, her equipment, her shooting locations, and her daily routines. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a carefully planned operation. The network of fake accounts all shared certain characteristics that suggested they were being operated by the same person or group. They used similar language patterns, posted during the same time periods, and had been created using the same technical methods to hide their true identities. Kim's team developed a new technique called behavioral fingerprinting to analyze the patterns of activity across all the suspicious accounts. By examining factors like typing patterns, vocabulary choices, posting times, and interaction behaviors, they were able to create a digital profile that was as unique as a physical fingerprint. Even when someone is trying to hide their identity online, they can't completely change their behavioral patterns, Kim explained. The way they write, the times they're active, the types of content they engage with, all of these factors create a signature that we can identify and track. The behavioral analysis revealed that all the suspicious accounts were being operated by someone who was active primarily during evening hours, lived in the Eastern Time Zone, and had specific interests in photography, outdoor activities, and what appeared to be military or law enforcement topics. More importantly, the analysis showed that the person behind the accounts had been conducting similar surveillance on dozens of other women throughout Florida and Georgia. Amanda had been just one target in a much larger operation that appeared to be building toward multiple attacks. The breakthrough that would ultimately solve the case came from an unexpected source. While analyzing the metadata from Amanda's social media posts, Kim's team discovered that several of her photos had been downloaded and manipulated by someone using photo editing software. The manipulations were subtle, usually just adjustments to brightness or contrast, but the software had left digital fingerprints that could be traced. The photo editing software being used was a professional-grade program that required expensive licensing and specialized knowledge to operate effectively. Kim's team was able to trace the software license to a company called Coastal Marketing Solutions, a small advertising agency based in Clearwater. "We had our first real lead," Detective Park recalled. "After months of chasing digital ghosts, we finally had a connection to a real business with real people and real addresses." Coastal Marketing Solutions was a small company that specialized in creating promotional materials for tourism-related businesses along the Gulf Coast. The company was owned by Michael Thompson, a 34-year-old graphic designer who had moved to Florida from North Carolina in 2018. When investigators obtained a warrant to search Thompson's business and personal computers, they discovered a treasure trove of evidence that connected him to Amanda's murder and to the systematic stalking of dozens of other women. Thompson's computers contained thousands of photos downloaded from social media accounts belonging to female photographers, fitness instructors, travel bloggers, and other women who regularly posted about their activities and locations. He had been organizing these photos into detailed files, noting each woman's routines, equipment, and preferences. Thompson had been building a hunting ground, Kim explained. He was systematically identifying targets, learning their patterns, and planning attacks. Amanda was just the first one he acted on. The digital evidence revealed the full scope of Thompson's activities. He had been operating over 20 fake social media accounts, conducting surveillance on women across multiple states, and developing increasingly sophisticated methods for tracking their movements and predicting their behavior. Thompson's search history showed extensive research into topics like stalking techniques, avoiding detection by law enforcement, and methods for disposing of evidence. He had been studying criminal cases, learning from the mistakes of other killers, and developing what he believed was a foolproof approach to committing the perfect crime. Most damning was the discovery of detailed plans for attacking several other women, including maps of their usual locations, schedules of their activities, and even practice runs where Thompson had followed them without being detected. "We realized we had prevented multiple murders," Detective Park said. "Thompson had been planning to kill several women, and Amanda was just the beginning. If we hadn't caught him, there would have been more victims." The digital evidence also revealed how Thompson had tracked Amanda to the remote location where she was killed. He had been monitoring her social media posts, noting her interest in wildlife photography, and had identified the north end of Clearwater Beach as a likely location for her morning shoots. On the morning of April 18, Thompson had driven to the area before dawn and had positioned himself where he could observe Amanda's arrival. He had followed her along the beach, waiting for an opportunity when she would be completely isolated and vulnerable. The attack itself had been swift and brutal. Thompson had approached Amanda from behind while she was focused on photographing shorebirds, had overpowered her quickly, and had carried her body to the remote mangrove location where it would later be discovered. After killing Amanda, Thompson had taken her expensive camera equipment, not because he needed it for financial reasons, but because he wanted trophies from his crime. The equipment was found hidden in his apartment, along with detailed notes about the murder and plans for future attacks. The digital forensics evidence was overwhelming, but Kim and his team had also developed new techniques that would be used to solve similar cases in the future. The behavioral fingerprinting method they had created was now being used by law enforcement agencies across the country to identify and track online predators. Amanda's case changed how we investigate digital crimes, Kim reflected. The techniques we developed to solve her murder are now helping to solve cases and prevent crimes that would have been impossible to address just a few years ago. The investigation had taken over a year to complete, but the digital evidence provided a clear picture of Thompson's crimes and his plans for future attacks. The technology that he had tried to use to avoid detection had ultimately been the key to his identification and arrest. Thompson thought he was smarter than the system, Detective Park said. He thought he could use technology to commit the perfect crime. But he underestimated how the same technology could be used to track him down and bring him to justice. The arrest of Michael Thompson would mark the end of one phase of the investigation, but it would also raise new questions about the extent of his crimes and the possibility that there were other victims who hadn't yet been identified. Michael David Thompson was arrested at his Clearwater apartment on August 15, 2020, 16 months after Amanda Garrett's murder. The arrest came at the end of a carefully coordinated operation that involved multiple law enforcement agencies and had been planned to ensure that Thompson couldn't destroy evidence or harm anyone else. Detective Lisa Park and her team had been watching Thompson for weeks, building additional evidence and ensuring that their case was airtight before making their move. The surveillance had revealed a man who appeared to live a quiet, normal life on the surface, but who was actually continuing his predatory behavior even as investigators closed in on him. Thompson worked from a small office in downtown Clearwater, creating marketing materials for local businesses and maintaining what appeared to be a legitimate graphic design company. His clients knew him as a talented designer who was reliable and professional, and none of them had any indication of his darker activities. But the digital forensics investigation had revealed that Thompson was using his business as a cover for extensive surveillance activities. He had been using his professional equipment and expertise to enhance photos stolen from social media accounts, create detailed maps of his target's activities, and develop sophisticated plans for stalking and attacking women throughout the region. The morning of Thompson's arrest, Detective Park had watched from an unmarked vehicle as he followed his usual routine, stopping at a coffee shop near his apartment, driving to his office, and settling in for what appeared to be a normal day of work. She had been struck by how ordinary he seemed, how completely he had hidden his true nature behind a facade of normalcy. Watching him that morning, you would never have guessed that he was capable of murder, Park later reflected. He looked like any other small business owner heading to work. But we knew that behind that ordinary appearance was someone who had been systematically planning to kill multiple women. When tactical officers entered Thompson's office, they found him working on a marketing brochure for a local restaurant, seemingly unaware that his carefully constructed double life was about to come crashing down. His initial reaction was confusion rather than fear, as if he couldn't understand why law enforcement would be interested in him. "Michael Thompson, you're under arrest for the murder of Amanda Garrett," Detective Park announced, feeling a sense of satisfaction that had been building for over a year. The moment represented not just the arrest of a killer, but the successful application of cutting-edge forensic techniques that had pushed the boundaries of criminal investigation. Thompson's apartment and office yielded a disturbing collection of evidence that revealed the full scope of his criminal activities. In addition to Amanda's stolen camera equipment, investigators found detailed files on over 40 women, including photographs, personal information, and surveillance notes that documented their daily routines and activities. The files were organized with the methodical precision of someone with a military or law enforcement background. Each target had been assigned a number, and Amanda had been designated as Subject 7. The files contained detailed schedules, photographs taken without consent, maps of frequently visited locations, and what appeared to be practice runs where Thompson had followed his targets to learn their routines. Most chilling was the discovery of what Thompson called his timeline, a detailed plan for attacking multiple women over the course of several years. Amanda's murder had been scheduled for April 2019, with attacks on other women planned for later in 2019 and into 2020. The systematic nature of his planning revealed a level of premeditation that shocked even experienced investigators. Thompson wasn't just a killer, Detective Park explained during a press conference announcing the arrest. He was a predator who had been systematically hunting women across multiple states. Amanda's murder was just the beginning of what could have been a series of devastating crimes. Thompson's background began to explain how he had developed the skills and mindset necessary for such elaborate criminal planning. Born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in 1985, Thompson had grown up in a military family. His father had been a career Army officer, and Thompson had spent his childhood moving between various military bases across the Southeast. After high school, Thompson had enlisted in the Army and had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan between 2004 and 2009. His military records showed that he had been trained in surveillance techniques, reconnaissance, and what the military termed target acquisition, skills that he had apparently adapted for his criminal activities. Thompson had received an honorable discharge from the Army in 2009, but his transition to civilian life had been difficult. He had struggled with employment, relationships, and what appeared to be untreated psychological issues related to his military service. His ex-wife, Jennifer Thompson, had divorced him in 2016, citing increasingly controlling behavior and what she described as an obsession with monitoring her activities. "He started following me everywhere," Jennifer told investigators during an interview conducted after Thompson's arrest. "He would show up at my work, at the gym, at places where I was meeting friends. He said he was just being protective, but it felt like surveillance. I was afraid of him long before we got divorced." After his divorce, Thompson had moved to Florida, ostensibly to start fresh and build his graphic design business. But the digital evidence suggested that his real motivation had been to find new hunting grounds where he wasn't known and where he could operate without suspicion. Thompson's military training had given him skills that made him particularly dangerous as a predator. He understood how to conduct surveillance without being detected, how to gather intelligence on targets, and how to plan operations that would minimize his risk of being caught. He had also learned how to use technology for reconnaissance and target identification. Thompson had weaponized his military training, Dr. Marcus Kim observed. He was using legitimate skills that he had learned in service to his country to commit horrific crimes against innocent women. It was a perversion of everything he had been taught about protecting others. The interrogation of Thompson revealed a man who showed no remorse for his crimes and who seemed to view his victims as objects rather than human beings. He spoke about his surveillance activities in military terminology, referring to the women he stalked as targets and subjects and describing his crimes as operations and missions. Thompson had completely dehumanized his victims, Detective Park noted. He talked about Amanda's murder the same way he might have discussed a routine military exercise. There was no emotion, no recognition that he had taken someone's life and destroyed a family. Thompson's confession revealed details about Amanda's final moments that had not been determined through physical evidence. He described how he had followed her along the beach, waiting for an opportunity when she would be completely alone and focused on her photography. He had approached her from behind while she was photographing shorebirds, had quickly overpowered her, and had carried her to the remote location where she was killed. The confession also revealed that Thompson had taken trophies from his crime, not just Amanda's camera equipment, but also personal items including jewelry and clothing that had never been reported missing. These items were found hidden in his apartment, along with detailed notes about the murder and photographs he had taken at the crime scene. Perhaps most disturbing was Thompson's admission that he had been planning to escalate his crimes. Amanda's murder had been intended as a test of his methods, and he had been planning increasingly violent attacks on his other targets. He had been studying serial killers, learning from their techniques, and developing what he believed would be an undetectable pattern of crimes. If we hadn't caught him when we did, Thompson would have become one of the most dangerous serial killers in Florida history, Detective Park reflected. He had the skills, the planning ability, and the complete lack of empathy necessary to kill multiple people without being detected. Michael Thompson's trial began in January 2022, nearly 3 years after Amanda Garrett's murder. The case had attracted national attention, not just because of the horrific nature of the crime, but because of the innovative forensic techniques that had been used to solve it. Legal experts, technology professionals, and law enforcement officers from across the country watched the proceedings to see how digital evidence would be presented in court. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Sarah Morrison, faced the challenge of explaining complex digital forensics evidence to a jury of ordinary citizens. The case would depend heavily on technical testimony about behavioral fingerprinting, metadata analysis, and advanced data recovery techniques that had never been used in a criminal trial before. "We were breaking new ground," Morrison explained during jury selection. "This case required us to educate jurors about technologies and investigative techniques that most people had never heard of. We had to make complex digital evidence accessible and understandable while still maintaining its scientific integrity." Dr. Marcus Kim served as the prosecution's primary expert witness, explaining how his team had developed the techniques used to identify Thompson and trace his digital activities. His testimony took several days and included detailed explanations of how behavioral fingerprinting worked, how damaged electronic devices could be analyzed, and how social media surveillance could be detected and tracked. The defendant believed that technology would protect him from detection, Dr. Kim testified. He used sophisticated methods to hide his identity and cover his tracks. But the same technology that he tried to use as a shield ultimately became the key to identifying him and proving his guilt. The digital evidence presented during the trial was overwhelming. Prosecutors showed the jury Thompson's network of fake social media accounts, his systematic surveillance of dozens of women, and his detailed plans for multiple attacks. They demonstrated how he had tracked Amanda's movements, predicted her behavior, and planned her murder with military precision. The most compelling evidence came from Thompson's own computers, which contained thousands of photographs, detailed surveillance notes, and what prosecutors called hunting journals that documented his predatory activities. The journals revealed a man who viewed stalking and murder as tactical exercises, complete with after-action reports and lessons learned for future operations. The defendant's own words condemn him, Morrison told the jury during her opening statement. His journals show a man who was systematically planning to terrorize and kill women across multiple states. Amanda Garrett was his first victim, but she would not have been his last. Thompson's defense team, led by veteran criminal attorney Robert Hayes, faced an almost impossible task. The digital evidence was extensive and technically sophisticated, and Thompson's own journals provided clear evidence of premeditation and planning. The defense strategy focused on challenging the reliability of the new forensic techniques and questioning whether the digital evidence proved Thompson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution wants you to convict my client based on experimental techniques that have never been tested in court, Hayes argued during his opening statement. They're asking you to trust computer programs and algorithms that may not be reliable. The burden of proof in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, and these untested techniques cannot meet that standard. The defense called its own expert witnesses to challenge the prosecution's digital evidence. Dr. Patricia Williams, a computer science professor from Florida State University, testified that behavioral fingerprinting was not scientifically reliable and that the techniques used to analyze Thompson's digital activities could have produced false results. Behavioral analysis of digital activities is still in its experimental stages, Dr. Williams testified. The techniques used in this case have not been peer-reviewed or validated by the scientific community. We simply don't know whether they produce accurate results or whether they can reliably identify specific individuals. However, the defense's technical challenges were undermined by the physical evidence that corroborated the digital findings. Amanda's stolen camera equipment had been found in Thompson's apartment, along with personal items that could only have come from the crime scene. His own journals provided detailed descriptions of the murder that matched the physical evidence exactly. The prosecution also presented testimony from Thompson's ex-wife and former military colleagues that established a pattern of controlling and predatory behavior that had been escalating for years. The testimony painted a picture of a man who had been developing the skills and mindset necessary for stalking and murder long before he moved to Florida. The defendant didn't suddenly become a killer, Morrison argued during her closing statement. He had been building toward this crime for years, developing his techniques, identifying his targets, and planning his attacks. The digital evidence shows us the full scope of his criminal enterprise, but the physical evidence proves that he acted on his plans. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, stalking, and multiple counts of harassment and surveillance. The speed of their deliberation suggested that they had been convinced by the combination of digital and physical evidence presented by the prosecution. We found the digital evidence to be compelling and reliable, jury foreman David Chun explained after the trial. The defendant's own words and actions, documented in his journals and computer files, provided clear evidence of his guilt. The new forensic techniques were important, but they were supported by traditional evidence that left no doubt about what had happened. Thompson showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same detached demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. During the sentencing phase, he declined to make a statement or to express any remorse for his crimes. Judge Margaret Foster sentenced Thompson to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional sentences for the stalking and harassment charges. In her sentencing statement, she noted the innovative investigative work that had solved the case and the importance of the precedent it set for future criminal investigations. "This case represents a new chapter in criminal justice," Judge Foster said. "The techniques developed to solve Amanda Garrett's murder will help law enforcement agencies solve crimes and protect victims in ways that were impossible just a few years ago. While we cannot bring Amanda back, we can ensure that her death was not in vain if it helps prevent similar crimes in the future." The successful prosecution of Michael Thompson marked a turning point in criminal investigation techniques, but the true legacy of Amanda Garrett's case would be measured in the lives saved and crimes prevented by the innovations developed during the investigation. Dr. Marcus Kim's behavioral fingerprinting technique was rapidly adopted by law enforcement agencies across the United States and internationally. The FBI incorporated the methods into their standard digital forensics training, and the technique was used to solve dozens of similar cases involving online predators and digital stalkers. "Amanda's case gave us tools that we never had before," explained FBI Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who directed the Bureau's Digital Crimes Unit. "The behavioral fingerprinting technique has helped us identify and arrest predators who might have remained undetected for years. We've been able to prevent attacks, solve cold cases, and protect potential victims in ways that weren't possible before this case." Within 2 years of Thompson's conviction, the techniques developed during the investigation had been used to solve over 200 cases involving digital stalking, online harassment, and technology-facilitated crimes. Law enforcement agencies reported that the ability to trace behavioral patterns across multiple platforms and devices had revolutionized their approach to investigating crimes that involved social media and digital surveillance. The case also led to changes in how social media companies approached user safety and privacy protection. Instagram, Facebook, and other platforms implemented new detection systems that could identify patterns of behavior associated with stalking and harassment, often before victims were aware they were being targeted. "The Garrett case showed us that our platforms were being used in ways we hadn't anticipated," explained Jennifer Walsh, who served as a safety consultant for several major social media companies. "We had to develop new approaches to detecting predatory behavior and protecting our users from sophisticated forms of digital stalking." The University of South Florida, where Dr. Kim conducted his research, established the Amanda Garrett Digital Forensics Laboratory, funded by grants from federal agencies and technology companies. The lab continued to develop new techniques for solving technology-related crimes and trained law enforcement officers from around the world in advanced digital investigation methods. "Amanda's legacy lives on in every case we solve and every victim we protect," Dr. Kim reflected during the laboratory's dedication ceremony. "The techniques we developed to catch her killer are now helping to make the digital world safer for everyone." The case also had a profound impact on the photography community, particularly female photographers who worked alone in remote locations. Photography organizations developed safety protocols and support networks to help their members stay safe while pursuing their artistic vision. The Amanda Garrett Foundation, established by her parents Robert and Diana, provided safety equipment and training to photographers working in isolated areas. The foundation distributed satellite communicators, personal safety devices, and emergency communication equipment to photographers who couldn't afford such gear on their own. Amanda loved her work, and she wouldn't want her death to stop other people from pursuing their passion for photography, Diana Garrett explained during a foundation fundraising event. "But she would want them to be safe. If we can help other photographers stay safe while doing what they love, then something positive can come from our terrible loss." The foundation also funded research into personal safety technology and supported the development of new devices and apps designed to protect people who worked alone in remote areas. These innovations included improved GPS tracking devices, automated check-in systems, and emergency communication tools that could function even in areas with limited cell phone coverage. Detective Lisa Park, who had led the investigation, became a national expert on technology-assisted criminal investigations. She traveled the country training other law enforcement officers in the techniques that had been developed during the Garrett case and consulting on similar investigations. Amanda's case taught us that criminals are becoming more sophisticated in their use of technology, Park explained during a training session for federal agents. But it also showed us that the same technology can be turned against them if we're willing to think creatively and push the boundaries of traditional investigation methods. Park's work contributed to the development of new federal guidelines for investigating digital crimes and helped establish protocols that are now used by law enforcement agencies across the country. The techniques she had learned during the Garrett investigation became standard procedures for cases involving online stalking, social media surveillance, and technology-facilitated crimes. The case also influenced academic research into criminal behavior and the psychology of digital predators. Universities across the country began studying the patterns of behavior exhibited by online stalkers and developing profiles that could help law enforcement identify potential threats before they escalated to violence. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the marine biologist whose research camera had captured crucial evidence in the case, became an advocate for the use of wildlife monitoring technology in criminal investigations. Her work led to partnerships between researchers and law enforcement agencies that used motion-activated cameras and other wildlife monitoring equipment to gather evidence in criminal cases. The camera that captured Amanda in her final moments was meant to study bird behavior, Dr. Walsh explained. But it ended up providing crucial evidence that helped solve her murder. It showed us that the technology we use for scientific research can also be valuable for law enforcement. The collaboration between researchers and law enforcement that had been essential to solving Amanda's case became a model for similar partnerships around the country. Universities began working more closely with police departments, sharing expertise and resources to solve complex crimes that required specialized knowledge and equipment. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to remember that behind all the technology, innovation, and legal proceedings was a young woman whose life was cut tragically short. Amanda Louise Garrett was more than just a victim in a criminal case. She was a talented artist, a loving daughter, and a friend who brought joy to everyone who knew her. Amanda's photographs continue to inspire people around the world. Her Instagram account, now maintained as a memorial by her family, serves as a testament to her artistic vision and her love for the natural beauty of Florida's coastline. Her images capture not just landscapes and wildlife, but the sense of wonder and appreciation for the world around us that defined her approach to life. Amanda saw beauty everywhere, her roommate Sarah Chen reflected during a memorial service held on the 5th anniversary of her death. She could find something amazing in the most ordinary moments, and she had the gift of helping other people see the world through her eyes. Her photographs are her legacy, but they're also a reminder of how much we lost when she was taken from us. The case of Amanda Garrett's murder demonstrates both the dangers and the possibilities of our increasingly digital world. Technology enabled a predator to stalk and kill an innocent woman, but it also provided the tools necessary to identify him, prove his guilt, and prevent him from harming others. The innovations developed during the investigation have made the world safer for countless people, but they couldn't bring Amanda back or heal the hearts of those who loved her. Her death was a tragedy that could have been prevented, and it serves as a reminder that we must remain vigilant about the dangers that exist in both the physical and digital worlds. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember Amanda Garrett not as a victim, but as an artist who found beauty in the world around her and shared that beauty with others. Remember the investigators who refused to give up on her case, the scientists who developed new ways to seek justice, and the family and friends who turned their grief into action that has helped protect others. And remember that in our connected world, technology can be both a tool for harm and a means of protection. The same digital footprints that enabled Amanda's killer to track her ultimately led to his identification and conviction. Justice may sometimes be delayed, but it need not be denied, especially when we're willing to use every tool at our disposal to seek the truth. Amanda's story reminds us that every person matters, that every life has value, and that those who seek to harm others will ultimately be held accountable for their actions. In a world that sometimes seems dangerous and unpredictable, that's a truth worth holding onto as we drift off to sleep, knowing that Amanda Garrett's legacy lives on in the lives protected, the cases solved, and the innovations that continue to make our world a little bit safer. Her light was extinguished too soon, but it continues to shine through the work of those who refuse to let evil triumph over good. Now let's move on to our last story. Story 5. On Tuesday, March 14, 2023, the morning mist hung low over Portland's International Rose Test Garden, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere among the carefully tended beds that wouldn't bloom for another few months. The city was just beginning to wake up, coffee shops along Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard starting to fill with early commuters, and joggers making their way through the winding paths of Washington Park. Portland in March has a particular kind of beauty, the promise of spring in the air, cherry blossoms beginning to dot the landscape, and that distinctive Pacific Northwest light filtering through the ever-present clouds. It's a city that prides itself on being different, on its quirky charm and progressive values, where people come to reinvent themselves and find community among the food trucks, breweries, and bookstores that define its neighborhoods. At 6:47 a.m., a jogger named Marcus Chen was making his usual loop through the rose garden when he noticed something that didn't belong among the dormant rose bushes. At first, he thought it might be a mannequin or some kind of art installation. Portland was known for its unexpected public art. But as he got closer, the reality of what he was seeing began to sink in. There, partially concealed among the heritage roses in the garden's northeast corner, was the body of a woman. She was lying on her side, almost peaceful-looking, wearing what appeared to be an expensive evening dress that seemed completely out of place in the early morning garden setting. Her blonde hair was arranged carefully around her face, and if not for the unnatural stillness and the obvious signs that she had been there for some time, she might have been sleeping. Marcus immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he tried to explain to the dispatcher what he had found. Within minutes, the serene morning calm of the Rose Garden was shattered by the arrival of Portland Police Bureau officers, paramedics, and the beginning of what would become one of the most complex murder investigations in the city's recent history. The victim was quickly identified as 34-year-old Victoria Ashworth, a successful interior designer who had moved to Portland from San Francisco just 2 years earlier. Victoria had quickly made a name for herself in Portland's design community, working with some of the city's most affluent clients to create stunning living spaces that perfectly captured the Pacific Northwest aesthetic, a blend of modern minimalism and natural warmth that had become her signature style. Victoria lived in a beautifully renovated craftsman house in the Irvington neighborhood, one of Portland's most desirable areas. Her social media presence showed a life that seemed perfectly curated, photos of her latest design projects, dinners at the city's trendiest restaurants, weekend trips to the Oregon coast, and evenings spent at gallery openings and wine tastings. She appeared to be living the dream life that so many people move to Portland to find. But as investigators would soon discover, Victoria's carefully constructed Portland life was built on a foundation of secrets, lies, and dangerous relationships that stretched back to her previous life in California. The woman who had presented herself as a successful entrepreneur starting fresh in a new city was actually running from a past that had finally caught up with her. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, was assigned as the lead investigator on the case. As she stood in the Rose Garden that morning, looking down at Victoria's body, she had no idea that this case would consume the next 6 months of her life and ultimately expose a web of fraud, betrayal, and murder that connected Portland's design community to a sophisticated money laundering operation based in San Francisco. The placement of the body was clearly intentional. Victoria hadn't been killed in the Rose Garden, there was no blood, no signs of struggle, no indication that violence had occurred at this location. Someone had brought her here, arranged her carefully among the roses, and left her to be discovered. It was almost ritualistic, as if her killer wanted to make a statement about who Victoria really was and what she had done. The evening dress she was wearing was expensive, a designer piece that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her jewelry was still intact, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her designer handbag was missing, but investigators would later discover that it had been placed carefully beside her body, its contents meticulously organized as if someone had gone through them looking for something specific. As the crime scene technicians began their careful documentation of the scene, Detective Martinez started the mental process that would guide her investigation for months to come. Who was Victoria Ashworth really? Why had someone killed her and brought her to this specific location? And what was the killer trying to tell them by displaying her body in Portland's most famous rose garden? The rose garden itself would prove to be significant. Victoria had posted photos of herself there on social media multiple times, always alone, always looking contemplative as she stood among the blooms. Friends later said she had mentioned that the garden was one of her favorite places in Portland, somewhere she went when she needed to think or find peace. Her killer had clearly known this about her. As the morning progressed and news of the murder began to spread through Portland's tight-knit creative community, the shock was palpable. Victoria had been well-liked, respected for her work, and admired for her apparent success in building a new life in Portland. She had seemed to embody everything that drew people to the city: creativity, independence, and the ability to reinvent oneself. But Detective Martinez had been investigating murders long enough to know that the people who seem to have perfect lives are often the ones with the darkest secrets. As she began the process of unraveling Victoria's story, she would discover that the successful interior designer was actually a carefully constructed facade, and that the real Victoria Ashworth had been living a double life that had put her in deadly danger. To understand what happened to Victoria Ashworth in that Portland rose garden, you need to understand who she really was beneath the carefully curated Instagram posts and the polished professional persona she had built in her 2 years in Portland. Victoria had arrived in Portland in January 2021, at the height of the pandemic, when many people were making dramatic life changes and the city was welcoming newcomers with open arms. She had purchased her Irvington Craftsman house with cash, a red flag that Detective Martinez would later investigate, and had immediately begun networking within Portland's design community. Her portfolio was impressive. She claimed to have worked with high-end clients in San Francisco, and the before and after photos she shared seemed to support her claims of expertise. She had a sophisticated understanding of color, texture, and space, and her work in Portland quickly gained attention from local magazines and design blogs. But Victoria's background story had some inconsistencies that nobody had bothered to verify in a city that prided itself on accepting people as they chose to present themselves. She claimed to have grown up in Seattle, but her knowledge of the city was superficial. She said she had attended design school in Los Angeles, but she was vague about which school and when. Most tellingly, she never talked about family, old friends, or her life before San Francisco. The truth, as Detective Martinez would eventually discover, was that Victoria Ashworth wasn't her real name. She had been born Jennifer Patricia Kowalski in Detroit, Michigan, in 1988. Her childhood had been marked by poverty, family dysfunction, and a series of foster placements after her mother's death from a drug overdose when Jennifer was 12. Jennifer had always been smart, resourceful, and determined to escape the circumstances of her birth. She had a natural eye for design and beautiful things, perhaps developed as a coping mechanism during her difficult childhood. She had worked her way through community college, studying art and design, and had shown genuine talent for creating beautiful spaces. But Jennifer had also learned early that the world wasn't fair, that people with money and connections had advantages that she would never have through honest work alone. She had developed a talent for reinvention, for becoming whoever she needed to be to get what she wanted. Her transformation into Victoria Ashworth had begun in San Francisco in 2018. She had gotten a job as an assistant to a high-end interior designer named Margaret Chen, who worked with some of the city's wealthiest clients. Jennifer was talented, hard-working, and eager to learn, and Margaret had taken her under her wing. But Jennifer had also been observing more than just design techniques. She had been learning about her wealthy clients' lives, their routines, their vulnerabilities. She had access to their homes, their schedules, their personal information. And she had begun to see opportunities that went far beyond interior design. The scheme that would eventually force her to flee to Portland had started small. Jennifer had begun skimming money from client accounts, altering invoices slightly, and pocketing the difference. Margaret's clients were so wealthy that they rarely questioned charges, and the amounts were small enough to go unnoticed. But Jennifer's ambitions had grown. She had started a side business, ostensibly offering design consulting services, but actually serving as a front for money laundering operations. She had been introduced to this world through one of Margaret's clients, a tech entrepreneur named David Kim who was involved in cryptocurrency fraud. David had needed ways to clean his digital currency gains, and Jennifer's legitimate design business provided the perfect cover. She would invoice his shell companies for fictitious design work, he would pay her in cryptocurrency, and she would convert it to cash through her business accounts. The setup was sophisticated and had been working smoothly for over a year. The problem was that Jennifer had gotten greedy. She had started demanding larger percentages of the money she was laundering, and she had begun keeping detailed records of the operation as insurance in case David ever tried to cut her out. She had also been skimming money from the laundering operation itself, something David had eventually discovered. The confrontation had come in December 2020. David had found evidence of Jennifer's skimming and had demanded that she return the money and destroy any records she had kept. Jennifer had refused, threatening to expose the entire operation if David didn't agree to make her a full partner. That's when Jennifer had realized that David was not someone to be threatened. She had started receiving disturbing messages, her apartment had been broken into, and she had been followed by people she didn't recognize. David had made it clear that she had two choices, disappear or face the consequences. So Jennifer Kowalski had disappeared, and Victoria Ashworth had been born. The transformation had been meticulous. Jennifer had used her savings and some money she had stolen from the laundering operation to purchase a new identity. She had found a deceased woman named Victoria Ashworth who had been born around the same time she had, and she had carefully constructed a new life using this identity. Moving to Portland had been strategic. The city was known for accepting newcomers without too many questions, and its design community was small enough that she could make a name for herself quickly but large enough that she could blend in. She had been careful to avoid any connections to her San Francisco life, and she had thought she was safe. For 2 years, the reinvention had worked perfectly. Victoria had built a successful business, made friends in Portland's creative community, and had even begun dating a local architect named Michael Torres. She had seemed to be living proof that people could start over and build new lives. But Detective Martinez's investigation would reveal that Victoria's past had been catching up with her in the weeks before her murder. Someone had been asking questions about her background, making inquiries about her business finances, and digging into her real identity. The pressure had been building throughout February 2023. Victoria had been drinking more, sleeping less, and becoming increasingly paranoid. Her friends had noticed changes in her behavior, but she had explained them away as stress from work and the challenges of running her own business. What they didn't know was that Victoria had been receiving threatening messages again. Someone had found her in Portland, someone who knew who she really was and wanted something from her. The messages had been cryptic but clearly threatening, and Victoria had known that her carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down. The last few weeks of Victoria's life had been a desperate attempt to figure out who had found her and what they wanted. She had been trying to liquidate her assets, preparing to run again if necessary. She had been researching new identities, new cities where she could start over once more. But this time, she had waited too long to run. On the night of March 13, 2023, Victoria's past had finally caught up with her, and the woman who had reinvented herself so many times had run out of new lives to live. Detective Sarah Martinez had been working homicide cases for over a decade, but there was something about the Victoria Ashworth murder that immediately set it apart from the typical cases that crossed her desk. The careful placement of the body, the expensive clothing, the missing handbag that had been found neatly placed beside the victim, everything suggested a killer who was methodical, organized, and trying to send a message. The first 48 hours of any murder investigation are crucial, and Martinez knew that every hour that passed without solid leads made the case exponentially more difficult to solve. She assembled her team quickly: Detective James Wong, a digital forensics specialist who could trace electronic communications and financial transactions, Officer Maria Santos, a bilingual officer who specialized in interviewing witnesses from diverse communities, and Dr. Patricia Adams, the medical examiner who would conduct the autopsy. The Rose Garden crime scene had yielded surprisingly little physical evidence. The killer had been careful not to leave fingerprints, DNA, or any obvious traces of their presence. But Martinez had learned that sometimes the absence of evidence could be evidence itself. The level of care taken to avoid leaving traces suggested someone with knowledge of police procedures or previous criminal experience. The autopsy results provided the first major breakthrough in the case. Dr. Adams determined that Victoria had been killed by asphyxiation, specifically by a type of chokehold that would have rendered her unconscious within seconds and caused death within minutes. The technique was precise and professional, suggesting that the killer had training in combat or restraint techniques. More importantly, the time of death was established as being between 10 p.m. and midnight on March 13. This timeline would prove crucial in establishing the sequence of events leading up to the murder. Victoria's body had been moved after death. The lack of blood pooling in her extremities and the absence of rigor mortis in positions consistent with how she was found confirmed that she had been killed elsewhere and brought to the Rose Garden. The killer had taken considerable risk in transporting a body across the city, suggesting that the location was significant to them. The investigation into Victoria's background began with her most recent activities and relationships. Detective Wong started by examining her phone records, financial transactions, and social media activities in the weeks leading up to her death. What he found was disturbing. Victoria's phone had received dozens of calls from blocked numbers in the 2 weeks before her murder. She had been researching how to change her identity, looking up information about moving to other countries, and had made inquiries about liquidating her assets quickly. Her bank records showed unusual activity as well. Victoria had been withdrawing large amounts of cash, transferring money between accounts, and had recently opened a new account under a slightly different name. The pattern suggested someone preparing to disappear, but who had run out of time. The social media analysis revealed another layer of the mystery. Victoria's Instagram and Facebook posts had maintained their usual polished appearance, but the metadata from her photos showed that many of them had been taken weeks or even months earlier and posted to maintain the appearance of a normal life. In reality, Victoria had been spending most of her time at home, venturing out only for necessities. Detective Martinez's interviews with Victoria's friends and colleagues in Portland's design community painted a picture of a woman who had seemed increasingly stressed and distracted in recent weeks. Her assistant, Jennifer Kim, reported that Victoria had been forgetting appointments, arriving late to meetings, and had seemed constantly on edge. She kept checking her phone obsessively, Jennifer told Martinez during their interview at a coffee shop in the Pearl District. And she'd jump whenever someone came into the office unexpectedly. I asked her if everything was okay, but she just said she was dealing with some difficult clients. Michael Torres, the architect Victoria had been dating for 6 months, provided more concerning details. Victoria had always been somewhat secretive about her past, he explained during his interview at the police station. I thought it was just because her childhood had been difficult. But in the last few weeks, she'd become almost paranoid. She insisted on meeting at different restaurants each time we went out, and she'd always sit facing the door. Michael also revealed that Victoria had recently asked him about getting a concealed carry permit, claiming she was worried about security for her business. She said she'd been getting strange calls from people claiming to be potential clients, but who seemed more interested in her personal life than her design work. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Wong's analysis of Victoria's financial records revealed the connection to her previous life in San Francisco. The cash purchase of her Portland home had been made through a series of cryptocurrency transactions that Wong was able to trace back to accounts linked to the money laundering operation she had been involved in. This discovery led to a deeper investigation into Victoria's real identity and her connection to the San Francisco criminal network. Working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, Martinez was able to piece together the story of Jennifer Kowalski's transformation into Victoria Ashworth and her involvement in the cryptocurrency laundering scheme. The investigation revealed that David Kim, the tech entrepreneur who had originally recruited Jennifer into the money laundering operation, had been arrested by federal authorities in January 2023 on charges related to a massive cryptocurrency fraud. During his arrest, he had been carrying information about several associates, including detailed files on Jennifer Kowalski's new identity as Victoria Ashworth. Federal prosecutors had offered Kim a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation in dismantling the entire criminal network. Part of that cooperation involved providing information about other participants in the scheme, including those who had disappeared with stolen money. Martinez realized that Victoria's murder wasn't a random crime or even a crime of passion, it was the elimination of a witness who could have testified against a larger criminal organization. The killer had been sent to Portland specifically to silence Victoria before she could be arrested and potentially cooperate with federal authorities. But who had sent the killer, and how had they tracked Victoria to Portland? The investigation took another turn when Martinez discovered that Victoria's identity had been compromised not through sophisticated surveillance or digital tracking, but through a much simpler method. Victoria had made a critical mistake in her effort to completely reinvent herself. She had maintained contact with Margaret Chen, her former boss in San Francisco, through a series of carefully crafted emails using anonymous accounts. Victoria had been trying to stay informed about the investigation into David Kim's operation, hoping to know if her former identity was in danger. But these communications had been monitored by federal investigators, who had been building their case against the entire network. When David Kim had been arrested and agreed to cooperate, he had provided details about all of his associates, including Jennifer Kowalski's new identity and location. The federal investigation had been proceeding slowly, building cases against each member of the network. But someone within the organization had learned about the investigation and had decided to take matters into their own hands rather than risk Victoria's cooperation with authorities. As Martinez continued her investigation, she began to focus on identifying the specific individual who had been sent to Portland to kill Victoria. The professional nature of the murder, the careful planning, and the obvious familiarity with police procedures suggested someone with a background in law enforcement or military training. The case was about to take another dramatic turn when Martinez received a call from the FBI's Portland field office. Federal agents had been monitoring the investigation and were ready to share information that would finally identify Victoria's killer. The call from FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen came on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Victoria's body had been discovered in the Rose Garden. Detective Martinez had been expecting some form of federal involvement once the connection to the San Francisco money laundering operation had been established, but she hadn't anticipated the complexity of what Agent Chen was about to reveal. "Detective Martinez, we need to meet," Agent Chen said without preamble. "Your Victoria Ashworth case is connecting to a federal investigation that's been ongoing for 2 years. We have information that will help you identify your killer, but we need to coordinate our efforts carefully." They met the next morning at the FBI's Portland field office, a nondescript building in the Lloyd district that housed one of the most sophisticated digital forensics operations on the West Coast. Agent Chen, a veteran of financial crime investigations, had been tracking the cryptocurrency laundering network for months before Victoria's murder had brought their cases together. "What you've uncovered about Jennifer Kowalski's involvement in the San Francisco operation is accurate, but it's only part of the story," Agent Chen explained as she led Martinez through a secure conference room filled with monitors displaying financial transaction networks and communication intercepts. The federal investigation had revealed that the money laundering operation was far more extensive than Martinez had initially understood. David Kim's cryptocurrency fraud had been generating millions of dollars in illegal profits, but the scheme to clean that money had involved dozens of participants across multiple states. Jennifer Kowalski had been a small player in the operation, but her position had given her access to information that made her extremely dangerous to the organization when she disappeared. She had been keeping detailed records of every transaction, every participant, and every method used to move money through the system. When Jennifer ran to Portland and became Victoria Ashworth, she took those records with her, Agent Chen explained. She thought they were her insurance policy, but they actually made her a target. The organization knew she had the information to bring down the entire network. The federal investigation had been closing in on the operation when David Kim's arrest had accelerated the timeline. Kim's cooperation had provided a roadmap to the entire network, but federal agents had been moving carefully to avoid alerting other participants that they were under investigation. "We were planning to arrest Jennifer Kowalski within the next month," Agent Chen continued. "But someone within the organization learned about our investigation and decided to eliminate her before she could be arrested and potentially cooperate with us." The breakthrough in identifying Victoria's killer had come through a combination of digital forensics and old-fashioned detective work. The FBI had been monitoring communications within the criminal network, including encrypted messaging apps and cryptocurrency transactions that the participants thought were secure. In the weeks before Victoria's murder, federal agents had intercepted communications between several members of the organization discussing the problem in Portland and the need to clean up loose ends before the federal investigation could proceed. The communications had been cryptic, but the timing and context made it clear that they were discussing Jennifer Kowalski's elimination. More importantly, the communications had revealed the identity of the person who had been assigned to carry out the assassination. Marcus Anthony Delacroix was a 38-year-old former Army Ranger who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before receiving a dishonorable discharge for conduct unbecoming an officer. After leaving the military, Delacroix had worked as a private security contractor before becoming involved in various criminal enterprises. Delacroix's military background explained the professional nature of Victoria's murder. The chokehold technique used to kill her was consistent with close-quarters combat training, and his experience with surveillance and reconnaissance explained how he had been able to track her movements and identify the Rose Garden as a significant location in her life. Delacroix arrived in Portland on March 10, 3 days before the murder, Agent Chen revealed, showing Martinez surveillance footage from Portland International Airport. He rented a car using a fake ID, stayed at a motel in southeast Portland, and spent those 3 days conducting surveillance on Victoria. The FBI had been tracking Delacroix's movements through a combination of traffic cameras, credit card transactions, and cell phone location data. The timeline they had constructed showed a methodical stalking pattern that culminated in Victoria's murder on the night of March 13. Delacroix had observed Victoria's routines, learned about her relationship with Michael Torres, and had identified the Rose Garden as a location that would have personal significance to her. The decision to kill her and display her body there had been both practical and symbolic, practical because it was isolated enough to avoid witnesses, and symbolic because it represented the new life she had tried to build in Portland. The federal investigation had also revealed how Delacroix had gained access to Victoria on the night of her murder. He had used information from the criminal network to pose as a potential client, calling Victoria and arranging to meet her at her home to discuss a major design project. Victoria, who had been trying to maintain her business despite her growing paranoia, had agreed to the meeting. Phone records showed that she had spoken with someone identifying himself as Robert Chen, an obvious alias, on the afternoon of March 13, arranging to meet at her house that evening. Victoria thought she was being careful, Agent Chen explained. She had insisted on meeting at her home rather than a restaurant or public place, thinking that would be safer. But that actually made Delacroix's job easier. He could control the environment and ensure there were no witnesses. The murder had taken place in Victoria's living room, the space she had so carefully designed to represent her new life in Portland. Delacroix had overpowered her quickly, using the military combat techniques he had learned in Afghanistan. The struggle had been brief and silent, with none of Victoria's neighbors hearing anything unusual. After killing Victoria, Delacroix had spent time in her house, searching for the records she had kept from the money laundering operation. Federal agents believed he had found and destroyed most of them, eliminating the evidence that could have brought down the entire network. But Delacroix had made a critical mistake. In his haste to complete the assignment and leave Portland, he had failed to find a backup drive that Victoria had hidden in her basement. The drive, which federal agents had discovered during their search of her house, contained copies of all the records from the San Francisco operation. "That backup drive is going to allow us to prosecute the entire network," Agent Chen told Martinez. Victoria's murder was supposed to silence her permanently, but it actually ended up providing us with the evidence we needed to bring down everyone involved. The federal investigation had also revealed Delacroix's location. After killing Victoria and disposing of her body in the Rose Garden, he had driven directly to Seattle, where he had caught a flight to Los Angeles. From there, he had disappeared into the network of safe houses and false identities that the criminal organization maintained. But the FBI had been tracking his movements through the same digital forensics techniques they had used to monitor the money laundering operation. Delacroix's use of cryptocurrency to pay for transportation and accommodations had left a trail that federal agents could follow. "We know where he is," Agent Chen said simply. "We've been watching him for the past week, building a case and preparing for arrest. But we wanted to coordinate with your investigation to ensure that he's charged with Victoria's murder as well as the federal crimes." The plan that Agent Chen outlined would bring together the local homicide investigation with the federal financial crimes case. Martinez would work with federal agents to arrest Delacroix and charge him with Victoria's murder, while the federal case would proceed against the entire money laundering network. Justice for Victoria Ashworth, or Jennifer Kowalski, or whoever she really was, Agent Chen said, is going to come through bringing down the entire criminal enterprise that caused her death. Her murder was supposed to be the end of the story, but it's actually going to be the beginning of the end for everyone involved. The arrest of Marcus Anthony Delacroix took place at dawn on April 15, 2023, exactly 1 month after Victoria Ashworth's body had been discovered in the Portland Rose Garden. The location was a nondescript apartment complex in Riverside, California, where Delacroix had been hiding under yet another false identity, working as a security guard at a local mall. The coordinated operation involved FBI agents, local police, and Detective Martinez, who had flown to California to be present for the arrest. As the tactical team surrounded the apartment building, Martinez reflected on the month-long investigation that had brought them to this moment. Delacroix had been living quietly in the Riverside apartment for 3 weeks, apparently believing that he had successfully completed his assignment and disappeared without a trace. He had been using the name Robert Martinez, an ironic choice that wasn't lost on Detective Martinez, and had been maintaining a low profile while the criminal organization arranged for his permanent relocation. The FBI had been monitoring his activities through a combination of electronic surveillance and physical observation. They had watched him go to work each day, shop for groceries, and maintain the mundane routine of someone trying to blend into suburban anonymity. But they had also been documenting his communications with other members of the criminal network, building a comprehensive case against the entire operation. When the tactical team breached the apartment door at 6 a.m., they found Delacroix in bed, apparently asleep. But his military training was evident in how quickly he assessed the situation and surrendered without resistance. He understood immediately that his cover had been blown and that fighting would only make his situation worse. "Marcus Anthony Delacroix, you're under arrest for the murder of Victoria Ashworth," Detective Martinez announced as federal agents secured the scene. Reading him his rights felt like the culmination of weeks of painstaking investigative work, but Martinez knew that the arrest was only the beginning of the legal process. The evidence found in Delacroix's apartment provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Federal agents discovered a detailed file on Victoria Ashworth that included her real identity as Jennifer Kowalski, her address in Portland, photographs of her daily routines, and information about her relationship with Michael Torres. The file had been prepared by someone with access to sophisticated surveillance resources and detailed knowledge of Victoria's background. More damning was the discovery of Victoria's missing designer handbag, which Delacroix had kept as a trophy. Inside the bag, investigators found Victoria's real identification documents, papers showing her true identity as Jennifer Kowalski that she had kept hidden even from her closest friends in Portland. The handbag also contained a USB drive that held copies of some of the financial records from the money laundering operation. Delacroix had apparently been instructed to retrieve these records and deliver them to his handlers, but had been carrying them when he was arrested. During the initial interrogation, Delacroix remained silent, invoking his right to an attorney. But federal agents had already built a comprehensive case against him using the evidence from his apartment, the digital trail of his movements, and the communications they had intercepted from the criminal network. The breakthrough came 3 days later when Delacroix's attorney, realizing the strength of the evidence against his client, opened discussions about a potential plea agreement. The federal prosecutors and Detective Martinez were willing to consider a deal, but only if Delacroix provided complete information about the criminal organization and his role in Victoria's murder. The confession, when it finally came, was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Delacroix described the murder as simply another assignment, no different from the military operations he had conducted in Afghanistan or the private security work he had done afterward. "I was told there was a problem that needed to be solved," Delacroix explained during the recorded interrogation. Jennifer Kowalski had information that could damage the organization, and she needed to be eliminated before she could be arrested and potentially cooperate with federal authorities. Delacroix had been provided with detailed intelligence about Victoria's life in Portland, including her home address, her business routines, and her personal relationships. The criminal organization had been monitoring her activities for months, waiting for the right opportunity to eliminate her. "The plan was to make it look like a robbery gone wrong," Delacroix continued. "But when I got to Portland and started surveillance, I realized that wouldn't work. She was too careful, too paranoid. She rarely went out alone, and when she did, it was always to places with security cameras or witnesses." The decision to approach Victoria as a potential client had been Delacroix's innovation. He had researched her business, learned about her design aesthetic, and had crafted a story about a wealthy client who needed help with a major project. The story had been compelling enough to overcome Victoria's paranoia and convince her to meet with him at her home. "She was suspicious when I arrived," Delacroix recalled. "She kept asking detailed questions about the project, about how I had found her, about my timeline. But I had prepared for those questions. I had done my homework about her work and her clients. The murder itself had been quick and efficient." Delacroix had waited until Victoria was distracted, looking at design portfolios on her laptop, before moving behind her and applying the chokehold. His military training had made the process clinical and professional. "She didn't suffer," Delacroix said with what might have been his only expression of regret. "It was over in less than a minute. I'm not a sadist, I was just doing a job." After killing Victoria, Delacroix had spent 2 hours in her house, searching for the financial records that his handlers wanted recovered. He had found some documents and a laptop, but had missed the backup drive hidden in the basement that would ultimately bring down the entire operation. The decision to display Victoria's body in the rose garden had been both practical and symbolic. Delacroix had needed to dispose of the body in a way that would delay its discovery but ensure it was eventually found. He had researched Victoria's social media posts and had learned about her attachment to the rose garden. She had posted photos of herself there dozens of times, Delacroix explained. It was clearly a place that was important to her. "I thought it would be appropriate to leave her there, surrounded by the roses she loved. It seemed more respectful than just dumping her body somewhere random." The careful arrangement of Victoria's body and the placement of her handbag had been Delacroix's attempt to create a dignified final scene. In his mind, he had been completing a necessary task while showing some respect for his victim. "I never learned why she had gotten involved with the wrong people," Delacroix said near the end of his confession. "But I knew she was just trying to build a new life for herself in Portland. I respected that, even though I had to kill her." The confession provided the evidence that prosecutors needed to charge Delacroix with first-degree murder. The premeditated nature of the crime, combined with the interstate travel and the connection to the federal money laundering case, meant that Delacroix would face both state murder charges in Oregon and federal charges related to the criminal conspiracy. But Delacroix's confession also revealed disturbing details about the criminal organization that had ordered Victoria's death. The network was far more sophisticated than investigators had initially understood, with connections to organized crime families on both coasts and international money laundering operations. "The people I worked for weren't just running a cryptocurrency scam," Delacroix explained during a follow-up interrogation. "They were moving money for drug cartels, human trafficking operations, and arms dealers. Jennifer Kowalski's records could have exposed connections that went all the way to the top of several criminal organizations. This revelation explained why Victoria's murder had been ordered despite the risk of increased law enforcement attention. The criminal network had been willing to eliminate her because the information she possessed was worth millions of dollars in ongoing operations, and her potential cooperation with federal authorities would have been catastrophic for the entire enterprise. The information provided by Delacroix's confession opened up new avenues of investigation that extended far beyond Victoria's murder. Detective Martinez found herself working closely with a multi-agency task force that included the FBI, DEA, and international law enforcement agencies pursuing leads across 3 continents. The backup drive that Victoria had hidden in her basement proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. The financial records she had meticulously maintained during her time in San Francisco contained details of transactions totaling over $200 million in laundered money. Each transaction was linked to specific criminal activities, creating a roadmap that investigators could follow to dismantle the entire network. FBI Special Agent Chen led a team of forensic accountants who spent months analyzing Victoria's records. What they discovered was a criminal enterprise that operated like a legitimate corporation, with different divisions handling various illegal activities and a sophisticated management structure that insulated the leadership from direct involvement in any single operation. Jennifer Kowalski may have thought she was just a small player in a cryptocurrency scam, Agent Chen explained to Detective Martinez during one of their regular briefings. But she was actually documenting one of the largest criminal financial networks we've ever encountered. Her records show connections to organizations we've been trying to infiltrate for years. The investigation revealed that Victoria's transformation into Jennifer Kowalski and then into Victoria Ashworth had been more complex than anyone had initially understood. The criminal organization had actually been aware of her activities in Portland for months before ordering her elimination, but they had been using her unwittingly as a test case for their identity creation services. The sophisticated false identity that Jennifer had purchased when she fled to Portland had actually been created by the same criminal network she was trying to escape. They had been monitoring her activities, learning from her successes and failures in maintaining a new identity, and using that information to improve their services for other clients. She was essentially a test subject, Agent Chen revealed. They let her think she had successfully disappeared, but they were watching her the entire time, documenting what worked and what didn't in terms of creating and maintaining false identities. This discovery explained how Delacroix had been able to obtain such detailed information about Victoria's life in Portland. The criminal organization hadn't needed to conduct extensive surveillance because they had been monitoring her activities since she had arrived in the city. The investigation also revealed the true scope of Victoria's involvement in the money laundering operation. Her records showed that she had been handling transactions for multiple criminal enterprises, not just David Kim's cryptocurrency fraud. She had been laundering money for drug trafficking operations, arms dealers, and human trafficking networks without fully understanding the nature of the activities she was supporting. Jennifer Kowalski thought she was just helping to clean cryptocurrency profits, Detective Martinez reflected during a case review meeting. But she was actually facilitating some of the most serious crimes imaginable. Her design business was being used as a front for operations that were destroying lives around the world. The federal investigation led to arrests across multiple states and several foreign countries. The criminal network that had ordered Victoria's death was dismantled piece by piece, with dozens of arrests and the seizure of assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. David Kim, whose cooperation had initially exposed the network, received a reduced sentence for his assistance in the investigation. But even his cooperation couldn't undo the damage that the criminal enterprise had caused over years of operation. The most significant arrest was that of Elena Volkov, a Russian-American businesswoman who had been operating the criminal network from a mansion in Beverly Hills. Volkov had presented herself as a legitimate real estate developer, but investigators discovered that her companies were fronts for the money laundering operation that Victoria had been unknowingly supporting. Volkov's arrest came 6 months after Victoria's murder, the result of a coordinated international operation that involved law enforcement agencies from 7 countries. The evidence provided by Victoria's records was crucial in establishing Volkov's connection to the various criminal activities and proving her role as the head of the organization. The trial of Marcus Anthony Delacroix began in Portland in October 2023, 7 months after Victoria's body had been discovered in the Rose Garden. The case had attracted national attention, both because of the murder itself and because of the larger criminal conspiracy that it had exposed. Detective Martinez testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the investigation that had led to Delacroix's arrest and explaining how Victoria's murder connected to the broader money laundering network. Her testimony was methodical and professional, but she couldn't hide her anger at the senseless nature of Victoria's death. Victoria Ashworth, or Jennifer Kowalski, or whatever name she was using, was trying to build a new life, Martinez told the jury during her testimony. She had made mistakes, she had been involved with dangerous people, but she was trying to start over. She didn't deserve to be murdered in her own home and displayed like a trophy in a public park. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Delacroix's confession, the physical evidence found in his apartment, and the digital trail of his movements to and from Portland created a narrative that was impossible to dispute. The defense attempted to argue that Delacroix had been coerced into committing the murder by threats against his own family, but the jury wasn't convinced. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Delacroix was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. But the legal proceedings were only part of the story's conclusion. The investigation into Victoria's murder had exposed a criminal network that had been operating with impunity for years, and the dismantling of that network had prevented countless future crimes. The money laundering operation that Victoria had been involved in had been facilitating drug trafficking that was destroying communities across the country. The human trafficking connections had been exploiting vulnerable women and children. The arms dealing had been supplying weapons to criminal organizations around the world. Jennifer Kowalski's records didn't just solve her own murder, FBI Special Agent Chun reflected during a press conference announcing the conclusion of the federal investigation. They provided the evidence we needed to shut down a criminal enterprise that was causing immeasurable harm to innocent people around the world. The investigation also led to changes in how financial institutions monitor cryptocurrency transactions and how law enforcement agencies share information about money laundering operations. Victoria's meticulous record-keeping had revealed vulnerabilities in the financial system that criminals had been exploiting for years. Detective Martinez returned to her regular caseload, but the Victoria Ashworth murder remained one of the most significant investigations of her career. The case had demonstrated how a single murder could connect to criminal activities spanning multiple continents and involving dozens of participants. Victoria thought she was just trying to survive and build a new life, Martinez reflected months after Delacroix's conviction. But her death ended up bringing down one of the largest criminal networks we've ever encountered. In a way, her murder led to justice for victims she never even knew existed. The Portland Rose Garden where Victoria's body had been discovered was eventually renovated, with new security measures and improved lighting. A small plaque was installed near the heritage roses where she had been found, not commemorating the murder, but celebrating the garden's role in the community and its importance as a place of peace and reflection. Michael Torres, the architect Victoria had been dating, left Portland 6 months after her murder. He had been devastated by her death and by the revelation of her true identity and criminal connections. In a final interview with Detective Martinez, he reflected on the woman he thought he had known. "I keep thinking about all the times she talked about starting over, about reinventing yourself and building a new life," Torres said. "I thought she was just being philosophical, but she was actually talking about her own experience. She really had started over, multiple times. I just wish she had been able to do it safely." The case files for the Victoria Ashworth murder fill several boxes in the Portland Police Bureau's evidence storage facility. But the impact of the investigation extends far beyond those documents. The criminal network that ordered her death was dismantled, preventing future crimes and bringing justice to victims around the world. Victoria Ashworth, born Jennifer Kowalski in Detroit, had lived multiple lives and died trying to build yet another one. Her story was a reminder of how the past can catch up with anyone, no matter how far they run or how carefully they try to reinvent themselves. But it was also a testament to how even in death, the truth can lead to justice for people who might otherwise never receive it. The rose garden bloomed that spring, as it did every year, indifferent to the human drama that had played out among its carefully tended beds. But for those who had worked to solve Victoria's murder and dismantle the criminal network that had ordered her death, the garden would always represent something more than just beautiful flowers. It would represent the complexity of human nature, the persistence of justice, and the way that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually give way to the truth. Victoria Ashworth's story had ended in that garden, but the investigation of her death had led to the beginning of justice for countless others whose stories might never be told. 2 years after Victoria Ashworth's murder, Detective Sarah Martinez returned to the Portland Rose Garden on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. The anniversary of the discovery wasn't something she officially commemorated, but she found herself drawn back to the place where one of her most complex cases had begun. The garden was different now, the security improvements were subtle but noticeable, and the heritage roses where Victoria's body had been found were thriving under the care of the dedicated gardening staff. Visitors to the garden had no way of knowing about the dark chapter in its history, and that was probably for the best. Martinez walked slowly through the paths, reflecting on how the case had changed her perspective on both policing and human nature. The investigation had shown her how people could reinvent themselves completely, but also how the past inevitably catches up with everyone, no matter how carefully they try to escape it. The criminal network that had ordered Victoria's death was now completely dismantled. Elena Volkov had been sentenced to life in prison, and dozens of her associates were serving lengthy sentences in prisons around the world. The money laundering operation had been shut down permanently, and the assets seized during the investigation had been used to compensate victims of the various crimes the network had facilitated. But Martinez knew that other networks would eventually take their place. The appetite for money laundering services, false identities, and contract killing wouldn't disappear just because one organization had been eliminated. The best law enforcement could do was stay vigilant and respond quickly when new threats emerged. As she stood near the heritage roses, Martinez thought about the woman who had died there, not Victoria Ashworth the successful interior designer, or Jennifer Kowalski the money launderer, but the frightened person who had been trying desperately to escape a past that had finally caught up with her. Everyone deserves a second chance, Martinez said quietly to herself, repeating words that Victoria had written in a journal that had been found in her home. But some second chances come with prices that can't be paid. The roses bloomed around her, beautiful and indifferent to human drama, continuing their ancient cycle of growth, death, and renewal. The garden would outlast all of the people whose lives had intersected there, but the lessons learned from Victoria's case would continue to influence how crimes were investigated and how justice was pursued. Detective Martinez left the garden that morning with a renewed sense of purpose. Victoria Ashworth's story was over, but there would always be other cases, other victims, and other opportunities to ensure that the truth eventually emerged from even the most carefully constructed lies. The Portland Rose Garden kept its secrets and its memories, but it also kept faith with the future, a reminder that beauty and justice could coexist, and that even in the darkest stories, there was always the possibility of renewal and hope. The morning mist lifted as Martinez walked back to her car, revealing the city of Portland waking up to another day of endless possibilities. Somewhere in the city, someone else might be trying to reinvent themselves, to escape a dangerous past, or to build a new life. Martinez's job was to be ready when those stories inevitably intersected with crime, and to ensure that justice prevailed regardless of how complex the truth might be. The case of Victoria Ashworth was closed, but the lessons it taught would continue to influence investigations for years to come. In the end, that might be the most fitting memorial for a woman who had lived so many different lives, the knowledge that her death had led to better methods of pursuing justice and protecting others who might find themselves in similar danger. The roses bloomed on, beautiful and eternal, keeping their silent watch over the garden where truth had finally caught up with lies, and where justice had ultimately prevailed. And so, we come to the end of tonight's stories. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.